Hello, dreamers and deep thinkers, and welcome back to Moonlight Science, where we wander softly through the borderlands between history, myth, and the stars themselves. Tonight's story begins beneath the glow of ancient fires, in libraries of clay rather than pages of paper. Long before pyramids, before Greece, even before Babylon rose from the desert dust, a civilization called Sumer carved its thoughts into soft tablets that hardened into eternity. Those clay records speak in wedge-shaped whispers. Mathematics, astronomy, kings, and gods who seemed all too human. But some fragments don't fit the timeline you and I were taught. They describe ages when humans served sky beings, when kings ruled for thousands of years, and when the boundaries between myth and memory blurred. So open your sketchbook of skepticism, pour a cup of curiosity, and settle in. We're descending into the Sumerian files, where archaeology meets mystery, and the past seems to remember more than history allows. The story begins not beneath neon lab lights or in climate-controlled archives, but under a Middle Eastern sun so bright it bleaches memory itself. In the mid-19th century, explorers and scholars followed rumors across what they then called Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. They expected ruins, perhaps confirmation of biblical tales, but what they found beneath layers of sand and baked clay would rewrite every timeline. Picture the scene. Tents flutter against desert wind. Local workers shoulder spades polished by use. A young assistant in a dust-stained waistcoat stoops, brushing away soil from an object small enough to fit in his hand, yet heavy with impossible weight. It is not gold or gemstone, but something far humbler. A chunk of baked clay covered in tiny wedge-shaped impressions. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a pattern of careless scratches. But when hundreds, then thousands of such fragments appear, the men realize they are looking at a library that time buried instead of burned. Those scattered tablets are pieces of an unknown puzzle. Scholars in London and Paris stare at them under candlelight, tracing each mark with nervous wonder. What could these symbols mean? No one can yet read the river of tiny angles. To their astonishment, some tablets hold lists of barley rations, others lists of gods. Still others star charts. Records of trade lie beside hymns to cosmic order, as if ledgers and the universe shared the same ink. Deciphering the code takes decades. An army officer turned scholar, Henry Rawlinson, hangs from scaffolding high on a Persian cliff, copying an inscription known as the Behistun text, a Rosetta Stone in cuneiform form. Each wedge corresponds to a sound, each sound to a word, each word to a thought from 5 millennia ago. When the script finally yields its voice, the clay begins to whisper. The librarians of dust start speaking again. What they say silences even the most skeptical minds. The words do not describe primitive tribes, but bustling cities. Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, already ancient before Egypt drew its first pyramid. They tell of canals dug with precision, laws written centuries before Hammurabi, mathematics framed in the rhythm of 60, and kings whose reigns stretch impossibly long. Out of the dirt rises a truth no textbook had foreseen. Civilization did not begin where people once believed. It began here, in a place whose memory the wind had almost erased. Imagine the wonder and the unease of that revelation. Everything first seemed suddenly out of order. Farming, writing, bureaucracy, architecture, astronomy, all traced back not to the biblical Eden or the Nile, but to this alluvial plain that had quietly incubated genius for thousands of years. Scholars speak of Sumer, adopting the name used in later Akkadian texts, and the very word feels ancient on the tongue, older even than history's own self-image. As excavations deepen, contradictions pile up. Mundane inventories of sheep and beer mingle with myths describing the creation of humans to toil for divine masters. Calculations of grain appear beside instructions for calling the gods. For every sentence of daily routine, there is one that points unmistakably toward the cosmos. It is as if mathematics and magic were written by the same hand, their boundaries unknown. The heat, the distant shimmer of the marshes, the ceaseless hum of insects, all fade when the excavators hold those tablets up to the light. The marks, so minute and methodical, still gleam faintly as though they were dashed off yesterday. Each stroke holds the tremor of a reed stylus and the breath of the writer who pressed it into wet clay. The archaeologists realize they are handling thought itself fossilized into symbol, a technology of memory so durable that even empires could not destroy it. And yet beneath the triumph of discovery lies an unease. Why did so much knowledge appear so complete? Why does the first civilization arrive fully formed, its writing complex, its astronomy exact, its myths already philosophical? It is as if the Sumerians awakened from nowhere, carrying the vocabulary of a lost mentor. Some researchers whisper of unknown forerunners, of flood-erased cultures whose echoes linger on these tablets. The clay does not confirm such tales, but neither does it deny them. By lantern light, the scholars stack tablets into boxes, labeling them with neat European script that already feels inadequate. As camels carry those boxes toward ports and ships and museums, the valley winds close over the dig sites again, humming through reeds along the rivers the ancients called the lifelines of gods. Somewhere beneath the dunes, others still lie buried, waiting for hands yet unborn to find them. The night settles above Mesopotamia, stars bright enough to scatter across time, and the world's first civilization begins to speak. Not with thunder, but with the soft, crumbling rustle of whispers from the clay. The more scholars read of Sumer's newly translated tablets, the more they realized the story was not confined to earth alone. Those wedge marks spoke of rivers that flowed not only across the plains of Mesopotamia, but through the heavens themselves. Sumer stood literally between the Tigris and Euphrates, two rivers that still define maps today. Yet, in the Sumerian imagination, those waters were reflections of something grander, a cosmic double, an invisible twin that mirrored the physical world like rippling glass. When we picture Sumer, we must imagine a land painted in silt and shimmer. Every year the twin rivers would swell, spilling brown torrents across low fields and leaving behind a skin of rich soil. Those floods were both relief and threat. Too little meant famine, too much meant ruin. Thus, water became a divine language. The people watched its moods as if it were a thinking being. They carved canals and measured depths, inventing the earliest irrigation systems. For them, to master water was to master life itself. And in that reverence, we glimpse humanity's first scientists learning by observation, their equations disguised as hymns. Among their words appears one that rhythmically hums through the clay. Abzu. Modern translations call it the deep, though its meaning stretches wider, suggesting an underground reservoir feeding everything above. In myth, it becomes the domain of the god Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water. To the Sumerians, the Abzu was not merely a natural spring. It was the blueprint of creation, the oldest sea from which gods and men alike were born. They imagined the earth floating upon it, stones resting on nothing but holy water. Even the stars, they said, had their reflections there. When present-day archaeologists study old floodplains carved by vanished channels, they see ghost rivers traced in satellite imagery. a delta web that shifts with every century. The Sumerians saw the same patterns without our technologies. From temple terraces, priests watched tributaries branch and curve. And in those restless lines, they perceived the veins of a living cosmos. Their gods were not strangers descending from distant skies. They were the very elements swirling around them. The wind that bent reeds, the flood that carried fertile clay, the sun that dried it into permanence. Theirs was a world where physics was still poetry. The link between the heavens and the rivers is written explicitly in the creation hymns. They describe waters dividing themselves, one part rising upward to form the sky's ocean, the other sinking to become the world below. Between those twin seas hung a thin layer of order we might now call existence. Modern eyes, used to cosmic radiation and disks of gas, can read a surprising familiarity there. A kind of proto-science encoded in story form. A prehistoric attempt to chart the origins of matter as motion within fluid. Standing in those reed-lined marshes, the people of Sumer must have felt both dread and belonging. When the horizon flooded with dawn light, the sky itself seemed to pour downward in molten gold. They called those rays the rivers of the sun. When night returned, the Milky Way became another river, a silver path threading across blackness, leading souls and gods alike to the other side. To the Sumerians, every flood mirrored that celestial current. The heavens bled their waters into the world, and the Tigris and Euphrates carried them home. Scholars today map those ancient perceptions onto sediment cores and delta strata. What they find is astonishing. Abrupt shifts in river courses around the very centuries when myths placed their sacred floods. Perhaps the stories remember real hydrological chaos transmuted into divine drama. Perhaps people saw the earth break its banks and, not yet having geology, imagined cosmic hands reshaping the land. In the imagination of Sumer, data and devotion blurred. Measuring sticks became ritual staffs. Rainfall was read as the handwriting of heaven. So when we read their hymns to the Abzu and traced their delicate canal lines across forgotten plains, we are witnessing far more than superstition. We are watching thought take its first measurements, watching wonder become method. Their rivers, whether flowing through soil or among stars, were their laboratories. Each flood was an experiment they decoded through mythic metaphor. And as those waters receded each season, leaving the land glistening and alive, the people stood at the threshold between the mortal and the infinite. In their minds, water was not only sustenance, it was memory itself. The living archive of beginnings that whispered continuously of where all things first began. As the rivers shaped their land, the Sumerians learned to shape the invisible currents of the sky. Every sunrise over the plains of Mesopotamia was a prediction fulfilled. Every sunset, an equation proven true. They became keen readers of repetition, noticing that the world moved like clockwork long before a clock existed. Grain ripened, floods arrived, stars returned to the same positions season after season. Somewhere between watchfulness and worship, they realized that the universe itself ran according to rhythm. And from that rhythm, they carved the concept of time. No one knows the exact moment the counting began. Perhaps a priest crouched on a rooftop at twilight, marking the appearance of Venus beside a crescent moon. Perhaps a farmer noticed that his canal water rose at predictable intervals. What we do know is that these observations grew into a mathematics of astonishing elegance. A system built not on tens, like ours, but on the number 60. To them, 60 was not random. It was the number in which harmony resided. 12 dozen half-shadows between dawn and night, 6 tens within a circle that had no end. From that base, they created divisions that still govern our days, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees to compass the sky. Every tick of a modern watch is a faint echo of their stylus against clay. It is not merely habit that binds us to their arithmetic. It is inheritance. Without knowing it, we count by their logic. We measure by their sense of symmetry carved under the same stars they watched, though the cities around them have long crumbled to dust. The temptation is to imagine such insight sprouting from technological void, as if shepherds suddenly glimpsed cosmic geometry. But Sumerian tablets reveal an education of careful accumulation. They mapped the heavens nightly for centuries. On clay discs scored with neat grooves, they tracked the movement of the moon, predicting eclipses with a precision that still stuns astronomers. Their horizon-level temples doubled as observatories, the terraces aligned to cardinal points. To mark solstices, they erected shadow posts that traced each day's light like a signature. Each observation lodged itself into memory until patterns became formulae, and formulae became calendar. Still, a mystery remains. Why 60? It is a generous number, evenly divisible by so many others, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But its perfection feels less accidental than destined. Was it chosen for practicality or inherited as something sacred? Some scholars whisper that this base 60 system predates Sumer itself, echoing from an older, unnamed culture whose science was lost in flood and exile. Others see the answer in the sky. 24 paths of the sun, 12 lunar cycles, 5 visible planets. Patterns interlocking like gears around the number that could contain them all. In city squares, time found tangible form. Merchants negotiated the length of hours the way they did cords of grain. Priests announced festivals on schedule with the heavens, staking human routine into the scaffolding of eternity. Children grew up learning to trace circular diagrams representing passing months, each wedge a promise that the rains would return and the crops would rise again. Time turned into a bridge spanning the uncertain space between hope and harvest. There is quiet poetry in imagining those early mathematicians hunched in lamplight, fingers stained with clay, scratching numbers into tablets they believed might please the gods. They could not know that far in the future, their digits would hum inside satellites orbiting the same stars they charted. Even now, our seconds, tiny slices of atomic vibration, fit perfectly within their ancient rhythm, as though the pulse of the universe has always spoken their language. Yet perhaps they themselves were listening rather than inventing. Maybe time already existed in the swell of the rivers and the movement of constellations, and the Sumerians merely gave it shape so that human hearts could follow its beat. In their eyes, time was not a cage, but a hymn, order drawn from the eternal drift of the cosmos. Each sunrise was a verse, each season a stanza, and each lifetime a single refrain, in a song that began before memory and by its nature would never truly end. As the Sumerians learned to measure time, they also learned the art of gathering it, capturing human effort, memory, and story in one place until the pulse of a few thousand souls became a single heartbeat. That heartbeat was called Uruk. Rising from the floodplain like a mirage of mud brick and shimmering canals, it became the oldest metropolis we can name, the city where organization itself first learned to walk upright. What had begun as scattered villages along the Euphrates fused into something new, a living machine that fed on cooperation, ambition, and law. Imagine approaching its walls nearly 7,000 years ago. They rose 40 feet high and stretched for miles, built from millions of clay bricks baked pale under a pitiless sun. To early travelers, It must have looked like the spine of a god, lying across the plain. Inside, lanes twisted through markets, fragrant with barley bread and date wine. Artisans spun clay into jars, scribes etched marks onto damp tablets, and caravans unloaded lapis from the distant mountains of Afghanistan. These people had mastered the miracle of collective purpose. At the city's center towered a temple complex that would become the model for every ziggurat to follow. It was dedicated to Inanna, the radiant goddess of love and war, protector of Uruk's destiny. Priests moved in measured patterns up its terraces, performing rituals timed to cosmic events, the smoke of their offerings curling toward constellations they had memorized generation by generation. From those terraces, one could see the entire city breathing, smokestacks, kilns, herds crossing river gates, each motion synchronized to the rhythms of the heavens. The architecture itself was astronomy made solid. But Uruk's influence was not only external. Within its administrative halls, clay tablets multiplied like a new species of life. Each tablet carried the marks of ownership, quota, or command. Bureaucracy was born here. Steady and impartial, an invisible hand guiding construction, irrigation, and trade. The clerks who recorded the movement of grain also recorded stories, and in doing so preserved literature for the first time. Somewhere among those shelves of clay, a poem took shape about a restless king who sought immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Whether he was history's flesh or collective dream, his name gave a human face to Uruk's boundless will. Yet beneath the administrative perfection runs a strange current of myth. The Sumerian king list, inscribed centuries later but drawing from older memories, claims that before a great flood, the rulers of Uruk reigned for thousands of years each. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000. To scholars of dates and dynasties, such numbers are impossible, stretching realism into fantasy, yet the scribes repeated them with unwavering precision. Perhaps those immense spans were symbols, mathematical metaphors for cycles of the stars, or centuries remembered in clusters of lunar months. Or perhaps they were something else. Echoes of a forgotten epoch when time was measured differently, when human life felt braided with the lives of the gods. Archaeology offers its own version of Uruk, composed of pottery shards, kiln ash, and the slow accumulation of earth. Excavations show a steady evolution from village to city, not a sudden miracle. But text and soil tell parallel tales that never quite meet. The earth says Uruk grew gradually. The tablets whisper that the city was gifted whole from divine hands. Between those accounts lies a silence wide enough to walk through, a mystery that refuses to choose between symbolism and possibility. By the 3rd millennium BCE, Uruk commanded perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, a number vast for its age. Its system of weights, taxes, and records turned chaos into pattern. Yet even amid this order, myth swirled through daily life. To an inhabitant, the king's palace was not merely government. It was the earthly reflection of heaven's own administration. Each decree carried not only authority, but ritual power. Every brick was stamped with the king's name, as though his presence had to be pressed physically into the city's flesh. Standing in the ruins today, with the wind whispering over cracked clay, one can still sense two Uruks overlapping like transparent maps. One belongs to archaeology, the pragmatic sprawl of humanity's first bureaucracy. The other belongs to memory, a golden city where gods walked alongside men and kings counted their reigns not in years, but in eternities. Between the two glimmers, a truth the Sumerians understood instinctively: that civilization was not built to erase myth, but to house it. And in Uruk's awakening, humanity built both the first city of the world and the first mirror of its own imagination. The songs of Uruk did not stop at its walls. When evening fell, and the canals caught the reflection of stars, voices rose from courtyards and temple terraces in languages half spoken, half sung. These were hymns carved later into clay under headings that translate roughly as the coming of the Great Ones. They tell of figures called the Anunnaki, the offspring of the heavens, who descended like bright lions to shape destinies, organize the fields, and teach humankind skills worthy of the gods. To the Sumerians, their arrival marked the border between wilderness and civilization, a moment when the world learned to speak. Modern eyes reading those ancient lines hesitate between awe and analysis. Could these shimmering visitors have been metaphors rather than literal beings? The Sumerians themselves seemed unconcerned with the distinction. Their gods were not abstractions sensed from afar. They were the direct atmosphere of life. The heat in summer, the fresh surge of river water, the shimmer of starlight at New Year. To them, the divine was not somewhere else. It pressed in from every direction, sometimes gentle, sometimes merciless, always real. In the hymns, the Anunnaki do not appear as a single tribe, but as a council, each member embodying a power of the cosmos. Enki represented flowing water and invention. Enlil commanded wind and authority. Inanna radiated both love and warfare. When the texts described them descending from the sky, that language might have meant the thundercloud on the horizon, or the numinous sensation that humanity felt when knowledge itself seemed to fall from beyond comprehension. The gods brought the gifts of plowing, brick-making, and measurement. They organized building projects and decreed laws. So in a sense, the Sumerians credited revelation for every advance, scientific progress as epiphany rather than experiment. Yet there is an eeriness to the precision of those stories. The tablets speak of shining chariots, of celestial suits that carried the glow of fire, of voices from the heavens instructing kings. Some of the descriptions sound uncannily technological to modern ears, accustomed to engines and flight. Over the centuries, this imagery has fueled speculation that the Sumerians may have preserved distorted memories of prehistoric visitors. Call them teachers, explorers, or myths that grew out of glimpses of natural wonders once thought impossible. But whether one prefers science fiction or metaphor, the affection in those texts is unmistakable. Their sky gods were teachers, not tyrants, mentors who raised humanity from ignorance into awareness. Inside every temple courtyard, statues of the gods stood not as idols awaiting worship, but as intermediaries through which offerings and prayers could travel. Music flooded the chambers. Harps plucked the same repetitive scales that might once have echoed during storms, tying human heartbeat to thunder. The city depended on such ceremony. When priests sang to Enki or Inanna, they were maintaining cosmic equilibrium, reminding the universe to continue its ordered dance. Religion was less a quest for morality than a treaty with the forces that composed reality. Every hymn therefore functioned as both gratitude and command, a coded equation spoken aloud. For modern researchers handling those tablets, the interpretation becomes dizzying. One line reads like astronomy, tracking stars as divine troops marching across the sky. Another reads like chemistry, describing how metals melt and recombine within furnaces symbolic of the gods' own bodies. Was it poetry, or an early language for science? Possibly both. To express natural order through emotion was their form of discovery. The Anunnaki may have been personifications of the processes that build worlds, the fresh water carving new soil, the wind erasing boundaries, the fertile forces that spark growth after flood. When night returned and the Sumerian plains cooled, families would gather, near lamplight, repeating fragments of those stories. In every voice was the same confession whispered across civilizations: that humanity never truly invents knowledge. It receives it, sometimes through study, sometimes through stillness, but always from something larger than itself. The Anunnaki, whether deities or memories, eternally represent that mysterious margin between comprehension and wonder. And in their hymns, set down on fragile clay that outlived empires, the first civilization declared the oldest truth of all: that wisdom is a gift descending from the sky, offered to anyone who dares to look up and listen. In the cool shadow of a temple wall, long after evening prayers faded into the reeds, scribes pressed stories of beginnings into damp clay. Among the most astonishing of these tales was the one that explained how humanity itself came to be. The tablets speak calmly, almost bureaucratically, of a world in which gods found themselves weary. They had raised mountains and traced rivers, but the labor never ended. The fields demanded tending, the canals constant repair. The divine workforce grew restless. Their complaints rose to the great assembly of the Anunnaki, and from that divine council came a solution both simple and profound. Let there be another race to shoulder the toil, creatures of strength and obedience who would till the ground and serve the gods in place of their exhausted makers. Thus begins the story of the Lulu Amalu, the mixed man. The text reads like a set of instructions rather than myth. Ingredients are listed: clay from the Abzu, water from sacred wells, the essence of a god who must sacrifice himself so that his intellect could be blended with earthly matter. With these components, the mother goddess Ninhursag, sometimes called Nintu or Mami, molds figures from the soil and breathes life into them. Their skin carries the hue of the land itself. Their bodies hold both divinity and dust. They awaken not into paradise, but into obligation. The first human gestures are acts of work. They irrigate, harvest, and build. To the Sumerians, service was not punishment, but divine inheritance. If gods themselves performed labor at the dawn of all things, then humans, made from the same clay, continued a cosmic rhythm rather than a fall from grace. Modern readers, accustomed to seeing creation as a mysterious event beyond comprehension, often pause at the hyperspecificity of this account. These priests and poets were describing a process of fabrication, even of biological combination, using the language of their era. To take the blood of a god and mingle it with clay, a metaphor, perhaps, for infusing spirit with matter, still sounds eerily close to the language of modern experimentation. Linguists have traced Lulu as mixed or blended, and Amelu as man or worker, phrases that seem almost technical in their neutrality. One wonders if the Sumerians sensed, with primitive yet poetic intuition, that life truly is a mixture. Mineral dust laced with invisible instruction, just as our own DNA holds the record of star-born carbon speaking through cells. When excavators lifted those tablets to light, some readers heard echoes of early study in anatomy and farming, projections of a society newly aware that flesh and earth obeyed shared laws. Others saw the tale as morality disguised as myth, a warning that even creators can be enslaved by their inventions. But to the Sumerians, the story carried reverence rather than guilt. Humanity's duty was sacred because it maintained the balance between divine and natural worlds. The act of working, of shaping clay, as the gods themselves once shaped, was a prayer performed with muscles instead of words. In Ninhursag's workshop, creation is iterative. Some figures speak but cannot stand, others walk but remain mute. The gods adjust proportions, perfecting humanity through trial and error. There is tenderness in those lines, an echo of empathy for the struggle of imperfection. The gods themselves learned patience through their crafting, much as later thinkers would sense an evolutionary patience underlying all life. Each version edges closer to endurance, to balance between strength and spirit, until finally the Lulu Amalu stand complete. Servants, yes, but also witnesses to divine creativity. Science, centuries later, would uncover a similar rhythm hidden not in clay, but in molecules. The processes that forge species, adjust traits, and ensure survival are as relentless and experimental as Ninhursag's own shaping hands. Reading those tablets now, it is impossible not to feel a current of recognition. Ancient myth and modern biology both reaching for the same secret: that life builds itself from repetition, from mixture, from the quiet revisions of time and chance. When the scribes finished pressing these words, they placed the tablets to dry in ovens warmed by the same sun that had watched over the city's birth. Perhaps they smiled, knowing that through this story they too imitated the gods, mixing dust with breath, meaning with marks. Humanity, in their telling, was made to labor, but also to remember. To work the earth was to sustain creation itself. To write it down was to ensure it would never be forgotten. And so the Lulu Amalu, the mixed ones, still stand, our bodies carrying the minerals of ancient rivers, our minds haunted and illuminated by the idea that even in servitude to the cosmos, we were built as part of its design, shaped to wonder about the hands that shaped us. For the Sumerians, humanity's story did not end at creation. It nearly ended in water. Among the thousands of clay fragments recovered from their ruined libraries lies a cycle of tales that describe a deluge so vast it scoured the earth clean of kingship and memory. These accounts are centuries older than the Hebrew Genesis. Yet when the flood tablet from Nineveh was first translated, scholars gasped in recognition at its familiarity. The world they saw had told this story before, with the same fear, the same surrender, the same boat riding out the wrath of the waters. The earliest version we know begins in a restless sky. The gods, weary once again, this time of the noise and disobedience of humankind, decided that their experiment had run its course. Rain was their verdict. They summoned the father of storms and split the heavens open, unleashing torrents that would wash away the ungrateful servants fashioned from clay. But the god of wisdom, Enki, could not bear the finale. In secret, he whispered the plan to a righteous man of Shurupak, whose name would later echo through scripture: Sudra, the long-lived one. In the dream, Enki told him to dismantle his house, build a vast boat, and seal within it the seeds of every living thing. The text reads with striking detail: pitch to waterproof the hull, specific dimensions for decks and beams, stores of provisions packed tightly against the coming terror. When the floods arrived, they raged for 7 days and 7 nights, blanketing the world in sound and darkness. The gods themselves became afraid of their own storm. They huddled like birds against the outer wall of heaven, listening to the drowned earth moan beneath the sea. When at last the thunder calmed and sunlight pierced the vapor, Sudra opened a window to release sweet fragrance as an offering. The gods, hungry for that smell of life, gathered and swore never again to destroy their creation so completely. They blessed him, granting him immortality in a far-off land, a gift and a warning both. Long after the last Sumerian cities crumbled, echoes of that story crossed deserts and mountains, retold in tongues that forgot their origin. The name Sudra became Utnapishtim in Babylonian verses, then Noah in Hebrew. The form of the story changed, but its heart did not. The world begins, the world rebels. The world is cleansed. When archaeologists in the early 20th century uncovered flood layers at ancient sites like Uruk and Kish, thick deposits of river silt cutting cleanly through older city remains, the resonance between text and soil returned with uncanny precision. A flood had indeed swept the plain sometime around 2900 BCE. But was this the worldwide cataclysm of legend, or a local disaster so immense that its survivors could imagine nothing beyond it? Modern geology suggests multiple deluges rather than one planetary drowning. The Tigris and Euphrates wander unpredictably, their banks shifting with each century. When heavy rains or upstream snowmelt coincide, they can burst their boundaries with ferocity enough to erase whole settlements. The low Mesopotamian basin, flat as a table, transforms instantly into an inland sea. For a population whose world ended at the surrounding hills, such an event was not regional, it was total. To them, the horizon itself was the edge of existence, and when it turned to water, the entire cosmos seemed to dissolve. Still, the Sumerians spoke of more than weather. Their flood was moral as well as natural, a dialogue between beings who had forgotten their gratitude and forces that reminded them of proportion. The deluge became a reset switch for history, erasing dynasties, returning kingship to heaven, and preparing the world for a fresh rhythm of time. Even in its destruction, the story carried mercy. One survivor, one arc, one continued pulse of life. It was not so much a tale of divine punishment as a reminder that creation itself is cyclical. Burial followed by rebirth. Water giving back the clay it once shaped. Today, standing over the mounds of ancient Sumer, where spades once uncovered silt thick as memory, one can still imagine the shimmer of an ancient sea stretching across the plain, reflecting a sky newly cleared of catastrophe. The myth of the flood endures not because it warns of divine rage, but because it comforts. Life, it promises, can begin again even when everything familiar has been drowned. When the waters receded and the land dried beneath a newborn sun, the Sumerians turned their gaze upward. Among their oldest cities was Eridu, a settlement so ancient that later generations called it the first home of kings and gods alike. Its ziggurat rose from the southern marshland like a step between earth and heaven, a deliberate link between mortal soil and the infinite blue above. In its courtyards and terraces, the priests who served Enki, the god of water and wisdom, found a new classroom, the sky itself. By night, the desert air cleared to crystal. The Milky Way drifted like a luminous river, mirroring the canals below. The priests noticed that if they stood at certain corners of the temple, stars appeared to rise and set in predictable paths along the horizon. They began marking those points with stones and clay pegs, eventually etching them onto tablets. Each symbol was both a calculation and a prayer, for in Sumer, the act of observing was inseparable from devotion. They were mapping the mind of the divine. Those earliest astronomer priests did not have telescopes. Their instruments were the simplest imaginable. Sight lines carved into mud brick, water clocks, shadow sticks, the patient accumulation of generations watching the same patterns. Yet from such humble tools came astonishing precision. They learned that the moon wandered through a repeating course of phases, lasting roughly 30 days. 12 such cycles brought the return of certain stars and the flood season that renewed their fields. Out of this harmony of sky and earth, the first lunisolar calendar was born. Inside the temple archives, they recorded not abstract constellations, but beings that inhabited them. The bull of heaven, the lion, the scorpion, these creatures still prowl our zodiac. When a cluster of stars crept beyond the horizon, it signaled planting. When another dipped low, it summoned harvest. The Sumerian constellations were therefore calendars written in light. They had transformed the night sky into an agricultural almanac, guaranteeing that heaven remained in conversation with the plow. Even more intriguing are a few broken tablets from Eridu and later cities that contain lists of the so-called wandering stars. These were the planets, bright lights that drifted against the background constellations. The scribes distinguished them from the fixed stars and gave them personalities: Nergal for Mars, Ninurta for Saturn, Ishtar for Venus. They realized that these wanderers followed vast, graceful loops, vanishing and returning according to cycles that spanned years or even decades. Such comprehension required meticulous observation over centuries, implying a chain of data inherited and refined through countless priests carefully transcribing what their predecessors had seen. Some modern researchers have run simulations to test those alignments described on the surviving tablets. A few correspond astonishingly with actual planetary conjunctions visible over southern Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BCE. To think that people without metal instruments could anticipate celestial events at all seems nearly impossible. Yet the evidence lies baked into clay for anyone to read. Whether their mastery was born of patient empiricism or handed down from much older traditions, we cannot tell. The stars keep their silence, and the broken tablets merely glow with suggestion. The roof of Enki's temple functioned as both altar and observatory. From its edge, a high priest might have watched dawn erase the brighter stars, timing the moment when Venus rose in tandem with the sun. Such alignments became omens, pronounced before crowds gathered in the courtyard below. Through them the gods spoke, but equally the scientists did. A commentary written not in words, but in angles and intervals. In Sumer, prophecy and physics were twin dialects of the same celestial language. As Eridu expanded, its reputation as a city of wisdom spread throughout the plain. Kings consulted its astronomers before launching campaigns or canals, believing that the skies mirrored fate. Yet those same stargazers, in their quiet hearts, may have sensed another truth: that the patterns above were not messages sent for humankind alone, but natural laws repeating endlessly with or without human eyes to notice. Tonight, when we trace Orion or watch Venus burn at sunset, we are repeating their gesture. The constellations have changed little since the nights in Eridu, when a priest looked upward and pressed a stylus into clay to record the position of a glowing point. Each modern calculation, each spacecraft launched toward a planet, is an echo of that first attempt to comprehend the cosmos with unaided sight. The astronomers of Eridu, working by lamplight in the world's first observatory, taught civilization not just to look at the heavens, but to recognize in their rhythm reflection of our own unfolding mind. In the centuries after the astronomers of Eridu carved the heavens into their clay, a new kind of curiosity began to stir. Observation was no longer enough. The Sumerians wanted prediction. If the stars and planets moved according to hidden rhythms, perhaps their movements could signal what tomorrow would bring. So the same priests who watched constellations rise now watched the world itself with equal precision. The flight of birds, the shape of livers pulled from sacrificial animals, the way smoke coiled from the altars. Every flicker in nature became a sentence uttered by the gods. They listened for meaning in everything. The result of this vigilance was astonishingly bureaucratic. Libraries filled with omen catalogs, numbering in the hundreds of thousands of lines. Each tablet was a quiet triumph of pattern recognition. If a lunar eclipse occurs on the 14th day, the king will face rebellion. If a dog gives birth to a calf, famine will visit the land. To us, these may sound like superstition stacked atop coincidence, yet beneath the ritualistic surface, a disciplined logic hummed. Over generations, priests noted what followed each strange occurrence. When patterns repeated, they recorded them as law. In this way, fear became data. Inside those archives, the idea of the experiment was being born. Their reasoning ran backward by our standards. They sought cause in omen rather than omen in cause. But the process was surprisingly systematic. They compared observation to record, checked for correspondence, and updated tablets when outcomes differed. Behind the incense and chanting, there was a scientist's patience. What they called divination was, in its rawest form, early empiricism. Take the study of eclipses. When Eridu's astronomers noticed that solar and lunar eclipses repeated over spans of years, their records transformed terror into calculation. At first, the sudden darkening of the sun was divine anger made visible. Later, it became a predictable phenomenon, whose timing could be charted down to the day. Priests who once panicked began instead to schedule ceremonies in anticipation of the event, an act of courage masquerading as worship. The cosmos had surrendered one more fragment of mystery to understanding. There were smaller prophecies too, domestic in scale but equally revealing. A birth defect or an oddly colored sheep might forecast political turmoil, not because the thing itself held magic, but because it reflected imbalance in the world. The principle was consistent. Order and chaos mirrored one another through signs. When the balance broke on Earth, the heavens shuddered. When stars stumbled from their courses, kings fell from their thrones. It was an entire worldview welded together by the assumption that everything was connected, that nothing occurred in isolation. Modern scientists, tracing the ancestry of observation, sometimes smile at the extravagance of these records, yet they echo our own hunger for pattern. Today we predict storms from pressure graphs. The Sumerians predicted destiny from constellations. Both rely on measuring cycles, searching for repetition in what first appears random. The difference lies primarily in language. Theirs poetic and divine, ours mathematical. But the desire behind both is identical. To feel less at the mercy of the world by understanding how it moves. The stone libraries of Sumer were more than repositories of myth. They were archives of experiments in thinking. Each tablet preserved centuries of watching, wondering, and correlating. Their diviners were not trying to manipulate fate so much as to converse with it, to persuade the universe into revealing its habits. And in those attempts, they performed the first rough sketches of what would later become astronomy, medicine, and even statistics. When one walks today through the hushed halls of a museum where those clay fragments rest under glass, it is easy to imagine the same silence that once filled the temple libraries. Rows of tablets stacked by moonlight, the dry scent of earth and oil, the faint hum of the stars outside. The priests who filled those shelves are gone, their prophecies long expired, yet the impulse that guided their stylus endures. We too keep recording, predicting, searching the data of our age for omens we now call probabilities. In every satellite orbit and computer model echoes that ancient moment when humanity first realized that the universe could be questioned, and might, if patiently observed, decide to answer. Among the tablets found in the great ruins of the South lies one that scholars approached with both amusement and awe. It was a ledger, nothing poetic at first glance, a list of rulers, the cities they governed, and the lengths of their reigns. Yet, as soon as the numbers were read aloud, the air of plausible history fell away, and something otherworldly unfolded. Before the Great Flood, it said, kings ruled not for decades, but for millennia. One king reigned for 3,200 years, another for 28,800. The scribe who mapped these reigns was not exaggerating a little. He was bending time until it stretched beyond human comprehension. This was the Sumerian king list, a text part chronicle, part theology, and part cosmic riddle. In those columns of wedge marks, humanity's memory struggled with its own scale. Why did the chronicler assign numbers so vast they challenged belief? Some early researchers dismissed the list as mere myth, a sacred genealogy showing divine approval rather than literal chronology. But others looked closer, counting the patterns behind the impossibility. The repeated use of 12 and 60, familiar sacred numbers in Sumer's mathematics, hinted that the enormous reigns might translate into cycles of the moon, planetary movements, or ritual calendars compressed into symbolic years. When recalculated through lunar months rather than solar years, those extravagant reigns shrink to lifetimes that fit within the boundaries of reason. With a few mathematical pivots, miracle turns back into memory. Yet the poetic lure of those antediluvian monarchs remains hard to shake. Each name on the list carries the scent of forgotten empire. Alulim, Alalgar, kings of Eridu, ruling in ages when cities were young and the gods still dined among mortals. After the tablet's midline comes the flood, slicing prehistory from history like a blade through clay. Kingship, the text claims, was lowered from heaven anew after the deluge, as if authority itself were a celestial resource granted to humanity in intervals. The list thus becomes not merely a document of who ruled, but an assertion of how order returns after chaos. Heaven chooses, earth records. When modern archaeologists compare the king list to other records, they find curious overlaps. Some kings named on it also appear in independent inscriptions found in temples and tombs. Others remain pure myth. The text lands somewhere between database and dream, as though the scribes were preserving fragments of truth inside the shell of legend. What if the pre-flood names record a lineage of remembered leaders from scattered proto-cities, their reigns multiplied by generations of oral retelling? Every story told across centuries stretches time a little, until the past becomes a horizon too bright to look at directly. There is another perspective, quieter and more mathematical. To the Sumerians, bookkeeping was sacred art. Numbers had divine temperaments. They organized creation. In giving their early kings such astonishing longevity, the scribes may have been expressing respect through arithmetic, assigning durations proportional to holiness. A god deserved thousands of years, a demigod hundreds, a mortal only tens. The numbers describe hierarchy, not time. Viewed that way, the king list becomes less a chronology than a hymn to continuity, a rhythm linking ruler to ruler across an eternal beat defined by 60. Still, it is difficult not to feel a faint friction of wonder. Could those enormous spans conceal some deeper fragment of memory? Perhaps the writers preserved echoing concepts from an age before measured calendars, when year meant any recurring natural cycle, the flood season, the return of a certain star, a sacred festival. Multiply those cycles by devotion and exaggeration, and the result is a timeline that, though impossible to our clocks, remains perfectly coherent inside a worldview where sky and rule were intertwined. The king list reminds us that history was never cleanly separate from imagination. In setting their rulers among the gods, the Sumerians transformed governance into cosmology, politics into physics. When they pressed those improbable numbers into clay, they were not defying logic but honoring origin, preserving the rhythm of a world closer to eternity than to death. And as we trace the stylus strokes today, we, can almost sense the pulse behind them. A civilization measuring itself against the infinite, determined that its kings, and by extension its memory, would live far longer than any body could endure. The Sumerians did not build merely to shelter themselves. They built to converse with the cosmos, rising out of the baked earth like mountains forged by mathematics. The ziggurats stood where sky and soil met, their stairways climbing through the air in counted layers. Every brick was a syllable in a sentence addressed to heaven. To look upon one was to witness theology expressed as geometry. A temple not only for worship, but for observation, calculation, and awe. The earliest of these monuments appeared first as simple platforms, meant to lift shrines above the floodplain. Yet generation after generation, priests and rulers added new tiers, raising the temples ever higher until they dominated the horizon. By the time of great Ur and Babylon, the towers had become vast fluted pyramids of shining glaze and burned brick, their colors coded to the heavens. Black for the underworld at the base, red for earth, white or blue near the summit where air thinned into divinity. The plan was always the same: a square foundation symbolizing stability, a sequence of diminishing terraces showing ascent, a small sanctuary at the top, facing the dawn. The pattern replicated the universe as the Sumerians imagined it. Solid below, ethereal above, with humankind poised, trembling in between. Walking up those ramps, the air thick with incense and sun, one could feel each step changing dimension. The dust of markets fell away behind. Wind replaced the sound of cattle and river. Every ascent enacted a pilgrimage through the layers of creation, the stairway itself functioning as a ritual calendar. Some scholars, measuring the alignments of scattered ruins, have noticed that corners point precisely toward cardinal directions, and that certain angles trace star risings, just as the terraces count planetary spheres. If true, every ziggurat was not only an altar, but an observatory, a fixed axis linking Earth's rotation to the cycle of light. Builders kept meticulous records of brick counts, grain ratios, and combinations of clay and bitumen. A royal inscription might list the weight of offerings alongside the number of levels, implying correspondence between spiritual merit and mathematical proportion. To build correctly was a holy act. Error could collapse balance between realms. The architects were therefore both engineers and theologians, servants of gravity and faith alike. When they pressed foundation deposits into the corners of each new stage, buried tablets pleading for eternal endurance, they were acknowledging that even the greatest structure depends on invisible stability, the stubborn patience of the ground itself. From a distance at night, when oil lamps burned along the terraces, a ziggurat must have looked like a constellation fallen to earth, each flickering flame an imitation of stars. In ceremonies, priests ascended carrying torches, appearing as moving lights against the darkness, symbolizing divine fire descending and returning. To the gathered crowds below, the ritual mirrored the sky's daily rhythm. Sunrise to sunset, life to death, descent to rebirth. Architecture had become choreography for cosmic forces. Later myth remembered these towers as bridges built too high, their ambition punished by confusion of tongues. Yet within the clay tablets of their builders, there is no hint of defiance, only devotion. The motive was not to challenge heaven, but to synchronize with it. By modeling the universe in brick, they believed they helped keep the real one turning smoothly. Humanity would reach upward not through arrogance, but through pattern, through replication of celestial order in tangible form. Even now, the remnants of those towers rise in the desert, like vertebrae of forgotten giants. The winds move through their broken stairways, carrying whispers of the same equations that shaped them. If one stands in their shadow at twilight, The geometry remains palpable. Square, circle, horizon, star. It was through such precise forms that the Sumerians spoke to eternity. In their hands, architecture ceased to be defense or dwelling, and became instead an act of alignment, a stairway of earth designed not to conquer heaven, but to remind both realms that they were never truly apart. As the first stairways reached upward toward the heavens, another kind of structure began to rise within the human mind, a system not built of bricks, but of fairness. In the same way that ziggurats aligned the visible world with celestial precision, the Sumerians sought to align human behavior with an unseen principle they called the justice of Utu, the god of the sun. Utu rode the horizon each morning in a chariot of fire, his light pouring over city and field alike. To the Sumerians, that even spread of warmth was the perfect metaphor for law. Impartial, constant, illuminating all without preference. Before the codified tablets of later kings, there was Utu's silent decree, an unspoken conviction that the radiance of the sun exposed both virtue and corruption alike. Those who lied or stole could hide under shadows for a time, but dawn would find them. And so, within temples and courts, priests invoked Utu's name before settling disputes, calling on his brilliance to reveal the truth that testimony could not. The old hymns called him the God who opens every eye. His justice was not vengeance, but illumination. One didn't punish wrong so much as bring it into light until it dissolved. In the early city-states, where trade brought fortune and envy in equal measure, this ideal became vital. Farmers argued over boundary stones, merchants over measures of barley. Scribes recorded the verdicts of temple judges, each decision a precedent pressed into clay. Slowly, these verdicts coalesced into custom and, from custom, into code. It was a moral architecture, every ruling a brick, every appeal another stair. While rulers often claimed that Utu's wisdom guided their hand, the record shows that justice was increasingly defined by evidence, witness, and written confirmation. Writing, once a tool of administration, became the guardian of fairness. The connection between light and truth extended into language itself. The word for righteousness, kittu, shares roots with words meaning brightness and clarity. To be just was literally to be radiant. Deceit was darkness. When the sun discs were engraved on seals and cylinder stamps, they conferred the owner's pledge to stand under Utu's gaze. Even coins and temple weights bore his emblem, ensuring that every transaction occurred in daylight, free from treachery. Justice, trade, and astronomy, each drew meaning from the same source of steady light. There are fragments of legal tablets from cities like Lagash that echo this belief in an impartial cosmic order. One proclaims, "The strong shall not oppress the weak, for Utu sees all." Another outlines penalties for overcharging, for tampering with river channels, for neglecting widows, proof that moral law was expanding beyond simple payment for misdeed. In such decrees, we can hear civilization negotiating its conscience, testing how divine oversight might be translated into civic responsibility. Kings no longer ruled by personal whim, but under sunlight. Legitimacy required transparency. The mythic tales reinforced this standard. When heroes swore oaths to Utu, the god responded not with thunder, but with illumination. Paths cleared, riddles resolved. His presence restored proportion to chaos. Even in the story of Gilgamesh, when the hero sets out across scorching deserts, it is said that Utu lights his way, a reminder that endurance and honesty share the same root in constancy of light. Centuries later, when Hammurabi would inscribe his famous code, he credited Shamash, the Akkadian name of Utu, as the giver of laws. The stele's bas-relief shows the king receiving a measuring rod and ring from the seated sun god, implements of divine judgment and exact proportion. The idea that justice could be measured, not improvised, was pure Sumerian inheritance. The beam of light falling equally upon ruler and laborer had become the cornerstone of governance throughout Mesopotamia. If you stand in the ruins of those ancient courts today, the sun still pours between broken columns as if continuing the ritual. Its rays paint the stones gold, drawing sharp lines across weathered carvings that once recorded verdicts. The message lingers intact. Truth cannot dwell in shadow. For the Sumerians, ethics began when dawn touched the city walls. A promise renewed each morning by Utu's return, ensuring that even after empires fade, the light of justice still finds its way across the dust. Even as justice took shape in the bright clarity of Utu's sunlight, another kind of light, smaller and more intimate, flickered inside homes and temples. The lamplight of healers. In a civilization where nearly every aspect of life was bound to divine rhythm, the quest to cure illness wove together two worlds: the seen and the unseen, the practical and the mystical. The Sumerian healers were not separate from priests or scholars. They were part investigator, part poet, and part magician, tracing the invisible threads between body, spirit, and cosmos. Cuneiform tablets discovered in the ruins of Nippur and Uruk preserve thousands of lines of what we might call medical instruction, although to the Sumerians, medicine had no separate name. These clay compilations describe herbs, oils, and minerals, lists of ingredients weighed in careful measures, followed by prayers to seal their potency. For the fever that grips the bones, one begins, mix crushed date pits with honey, recite the name of Gula, the goddess of healing, and place the balm upon the brow. To modern readers, the invocation may seem superstitious, but the recipe itself carries genuine pharmacological sense. Honey's antiseptic qualities and the tannins in date seeds would indeed soothe infection. Across the tablets, one can see science being born in slow, uneven breaths. Observations of cause and effect lurk behind the ritual language. If a salve reduced swelling, it was recorded. If it failed, another combination was attempted. Over generations, such pragmatic notes evolved into standardized instructions. The healer's library became a vast experiment, written in poetic shorthand. They lacked microscopes and theories of disease, but they understood patterns, recognizing that certain plants yielded predictable results. Every treatment began with diagnosis, though that word too had sacred overtones. The healer, called an azu, read symptoms like an astronomer reading stars. A dry cough could mean angering of a wind god, stomach pain, a spirit out of balance. Yet these interpretations hid a system of classification almost clinical in its observation. The same tablet that attributes fever to divine wrath also describes cooling draughts, rest in shade, and plentiful water. An early understanding of hydration centuries before germ theory. The heavenly explanation gave moral meaning. The practical care brought real relief. Some remedies blur the line between miracle and method. Clay seals name over 250 identified plants: mandrake, saffron, myrrh, coriander, willow bark. The last of these, later recognized as a source of salicylic acid, the basis of modern aspirin, appears repeatedly in prescriptions for pain. Here, beneath the language of enchantment, tangible wisdom takes root. It was as though magic provided the frame within which experimentation could safely unfold. The gods approved what careful observation confirmed. The goddess Gula, often portrayed with a dog beside her, embodied this union. Temples dedicated to her served as the world's first clinics, offering both prayer and plant-based treatments. Her emblem, a scalpel-shaped rod, became a symbol of compassionate precision. Patients left inscribed clay figurines of afflicted bodies, arms, livers, eyes, asking for relief, an early form of medical record and psychological consolation. Faith worked alongside remedy as balm for the invisible aches of fear. Those who practiced healing carried an ethical responsibility similar to Utu's justice, to restore balance rather than merely remove pain. Sickness was disruption, health, harmony. The healer's task was to mediate between chaos and order, just as judges mediated between quarrels or astronomers between earth and sky. Each profession mirrored the same cosmic principle: alignment through knowledge, respect through careful attention. Even in our laboratories today, lit by brighter lamps but guided by that same patience, this Sumerian inheritance endures. We still chant formulas, though now in chemical equations. We still trust that observation repeated enough times becomes truth. The tablets of the Azu whisper from their shelves in museums, reminding us that science and faith were never enemies at the dawn of civilization. They were twin instincts rising from the same longing to soothe the fragile body and to understand the greater forces that move within it. And under their mingled glow, the first physicians of the world pressed their reeds into clay, leaving behind not just cures, but the earliest heartbeat of reason itself. Between the fragrance of temple incense and the dry hiss of desert wind, another current moved through Sumer, one that did not flow through rivers or canals, but through air. It was music, invisible yet shaping everything it touched, a language of vibration that echoed from ziggurat to field. The Sumerians treated sound not as mere decoration or entertainment, but as a force capable of realignment, capable, they believed, of retuning the world when balance threatened to falter. Archaeologists have found traces of this unseen art in the remnants of instruments buried for 5,000 years. In the royal tombs of Uruk lay the bull lyre, its wooden body adorned with gold, lapis, and the sculpted head of a calm, listening creature. Nearby, silver flutes rested in silence, their reeds long turned to dust, yet their holes still spaced in perfect intervals that could match modern scales. When these relics were reconstructed and played, the tones they produced were haunting, low, steady, and woven around a rhythm both foreign and familiar. It was as if the thunder of ancient ceremonies had briefly opened its throat to speak again. In temple rituals, sound bridged human breath and divine order. The priests who chanted hymns before Utu's sunrise or Gula's healing fires believed their voices carried literal power, vibrations reaching the ears of the gods. They sang not to please, but to adjust, each note a pulse designed to strengthen the invisible web between heaven and earth. The major instruments represented cosmic forces: drums for Earth's heartbeat, harps for the coursing of celestial waters, wind instruments for the whisper of spirit through matter. Even the act of tuning the strings was symbolic, aligning chaos into harmony, noise into purpose. Later, scribes described music as the measuring of air. That phrase might have sounded metaphorical to them, yet it captures something astonishingly physical to us. Modern science has shown that sound indeed shapes the world. Waves form geometry in sand. Vibrations organize particles into patterns. Quantum physicists use similar language when speaking of resonance, frequencies rippling through the microcosm of energy fields. The Sumerians could not have known the mathematics behind this phenomenon, but intuitively they felt that every form, every being, carried a tone, that reality itself was a vast chord waiting to be played without discord. During the festivals that marked new seasons, entire cities became orchestras. Drums pounded like thunderheads over the plain, lyres murmured counter-melodies, and singers chanted the long, trembling syllables of devotion until the air itself seemed alive. Such spectacles aligned more than devotion. They regulated collective emotion. Music unified the city the way irrigation unified its fields, letting thousands breathe and sway to one pulse. The boundary between art and administration blurred. Governance expressed as rhythm, community as chorus. Archaeologists studying temple acoustics noticed the architect's attention to resonance. The inner chambers of certain ziggurats magnify particular frequencies so that even a single drum beat could vibrate through walls and floor, giving supplicants a visceral sense of divine presence. The builders clearly understood that sound creates space as much as stone does. They built with echo in mind, inscribing physics in mud bricks long before formulas named it. In the evenings, away from ritual formality, musicians played in the courtyards for kings and merchants, singing epics of Gilgamesh or songs of love and harvest. Even then, melody retained its ancient reverence, weaving daily life back toward the cosmic rhythm from which it had emerged. A Sumerian worker returning from the fields might hum the same refrain heard in temple ceremonies, believing that his voice, humble, tired, untrained, still carried a fragment of divine resonance. When modern players coax notes from those reconstructed lyres, they awaken more than curiosity. Each vibration crosses the centuries like a bridge of air, proof that though civilizations crumble, their frequencies remain, threading through atoms, through memory, through us. The Sumerians listened to a universe that sang back. We, equipped with amplifiers and equations, are only beginning to realize that it still does. In that endless song lies the quiet truth they intuited so long ago. Creation is not solid, but sounding an eternal chord reverberating through matter, waiting for us once again to join in tune. In the hush that followed the last note of a temple hymn, when torches dimmed and wind drifted softly through reed windows, the Sumerians turned inward. For all their devotion to measured stars and divine architecture, they believed the gods also wrote upon the private sky of the mind. The world of dreams was not a playground of imagination, but a frontier between matter and spirit. To sleep was to step beyond the gate of waking and converse with powers that shaped both destiny and conscience. Clay tablets from the libraries of Assur and Mari preserve traces of this inner science. They read almost like guides, catalogs of visions categorized by imagery, color, and emotional weight. If a man dreams of a flood that carries him unharmed, one tablet says, the gods will cleanse his troubles. If he drowns, a debt will claim him. Another lists sequences of symbols, a broken tablet, an eclipse, a fish speaking from water, each linked to omens derived from generations of interpretation. Collectively, they form humanity's earliest textbook of psychology, half spiritual manual, half diagnostic chart. The Sumerians called the dream world the place of meeting. They imagined it as a region the soul visited while the body rested, a landscape lit not by suns, but by memory and divine signal. Within it walked the Atemu, the shadow self that communed with ancestors and gods, returning at dawn with messages encoded in images. To ignore such messages was perilous. Kings consulted their dream interpreters before battles. Merchants sought guidance before trade voyages. A single restless night could redirect policy, rebuild temples, or doom expeditions. Dreams were not private musings. They were diplomacy with the heavens. Yet for all their reverence, the Sumerians approached dreams with surprising pragmatism. Alongside their incantations, they recorded cause and effect. Bad sleep followed too much wine. Prophetic dreams arrived after fasting or moonlit prayer. They observed patterns, noting that emotional turmoil could warp the content of vision. In their way, they were already practicing sleep studies, treating the mind as an organ both divine and fallible. What later science would call the subconscious, they regarded as a sacred mirror reflecting both personal desire and cosmic mood. Many dreams centered on flight or ascent. Common symbols even now. Those who dreamed of climbing stairways or soaring among bright figures were said to have glimpsed the dwellings of the gods, the sky people. These celestial visitors, luminous beings who walked through starlight, were not aliens of modern fantasy, but embodiments of enlightenment. They represented knowledge unbound by clay or gravity, offering glimpses of higher order. To dream of them was to remember that the spirit could still rise, no matter how heavy the dust of day. Archaeologists have also found small terracotta plaques placed under pillows or near sleeping chambers bearing inscriptions of protection and invocation. The sleeper carved a plea for peaceful visions and left it beside their bed, trusting that words pressed into clay could shape the invisible architectures of the mind. In these rituals of rest, one senses the birth of introspection, a culture learning to explore not merely the heavens above, but the vastness within. Modern neuroscience, with its electrodes and brain scans, examines sleep much as those early priests studied stars, searching for the code that unites chaos with rhythm. When they chart neural waves, they too are mapping unseen constellations, electrical shadows of dreaming consciousness that flicker with our hidden lives. The difference lies only in language. We speak of REM cycles instead of the sky people, neurotransmitters instead of divine messengers. Yet the wonder remains unchanged. To dream is to remember that the universe has always reached toward awareness, that perhaps our most private visions are echoes of its own unfolding. The Sumerians might have said that when we close our eyes and drift into that interior cosmos, we join the gods in their nightly dialogue, carrying the same ancient hope, that through sleep, wisdom descends quietly upon the heart like starlight returning to the earth. Beneath the same heavens where Sumer's astronomers traced the paths of stars, their poets looked downward into another kind of cosmos, the one carved from shadow. Here they imagined a mirror realm beneath the fertile earth, a place not of torment but of stillness, where power sank before it rose again. The most famous map of that invisible world is told through the hymn of Inanna, the radiant queen of heaven and war, who dared to cross its 7 gates. Her descent was no mere story of vanity or vengeance. It was a lesson in transformation written in the language of myth and memory. The clay tablets recount her journey with ritual precision. She adorned herself in layers, crown, necklace, breastplate, robes, and the shimmering eyeliner of divine authority, and descended toward the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, ruler of the dead. At each gate she was stopped, questioned, and made to surrender one piece of her regalia. By the time she reached the deepest chamber, she stood naked and bowed low, stripped of title and protection. There, the laws of the underworld claimed her body, and Inanna hung lifeless upon a hook while the upper world withered without her light. Only after 3 days, through the cunning of messengers and the mercy of the gods, did she ascend again, reborn through the final gate. The pattern is unmistakable. Descent, dissolution, return. It is a map not of geography, but of transformation, a sequence of loss that leads to revelation. To the ancient Sumerians, the underworld was not punishment, but process, mirroring the moon's dark phase and the seasonal death of crops before their renewal. The 7 gates correspond neatly to 7 celestial spheres, the steps by which a planet disappears into the sun's glare before re-emerging in morning light. Eridu's astronomers, who could track these vanishings with uncanny accuracy, would have recognized the symbolism instantly. The story of Inanna was not separate from their science. It was science given soul. Her surrender of ornaments reflects not humiliation, but purification. Each gate marks a boundary where extraneous weight must be shed, just as the stars lose brightness when swallowed by the horizon. The myth thus becomes a parable of equilibrium. To reach the heart of mystery, one must travel light. And when Inanna returns, her ascent echoes the first thin crescent of moon after darkness, a rebirth both astronomical and personal. Modern scholars have also seen in the tale an allegory of psychology. The descent mirrors the inward journey of consciousness, peeling away its illusions. In this light, Inanna becomes the archetype of awakening, confronting the shadow self, meeting its twin in Ereshkigal, and emerging changed. Centuries before philosophy named the process introspection, this myth taught that wisdom often comes disguised as surrender. Excavations at Uruk have unearthed small plaques depicting two female figures facing each other across a gate. Some believe these were charms used in funerary rituals, symbolic passports for the soul. The Sumerians saw death as another crossing, not an ending, but entrance into a rhythm larger than one life. By memorizing and retelling Inanna's journey, they rehearsed the pattern of decline and rebirth inherent in both nature and the self. Even the physical act of reading the poem tunneled downward. Each line pressed into clay from top to bottom, each tablet part of a deeper sequence. The reader descends through symbols and ascends again in understanding. Through this simple inversion, the scribes unknowingly invented the narrative of metamorphosis that would echo through countless later myths. From Persephone's captivity to humanity's pursuit of enlightenment in darkness. Perhaps that is why the story still resonates beyond faith or archaeology. It speaks to every cycle of discovery. Scientists, too, descend when they enter the unknown, stripped of certainty at each gate until a new truth rises to meet them. What Inanna found at the end of her journey was not Ereshkigal's destruction, but balance. The light learning from the dark. And through her return, the Sumerians declared a truth that still feels modern. That descent is not failure, but preparation, the necessary fall by which all knowledge learns to rise. From the depths of Inanna's descent and the symbols that captured mystery and story, the Sumerians turned again towards something equally miraculous. The crafting of sound into sign, thought into permanence. Their greatest invention was not a monument or a machine, but the ability to trap speech inside matter. Writing began modestly, almost shyly, as marks scratched onto clay to count grain or record ownership. Yet those small impressions would become the framework for empires, the nervous system of civilization, and the first tangible architecture of memory. In the beginning, every transaction had its clay token, a sphere for grain, a cone for sheep, a disk for days' labor. When traders needed to track quantities, they sealed these shapes inside hollow clay envelopes called boule, marking the surface with symbols that mirrored the tokens within. Over time, the outer marks proved sufficient on their own. The tokens disappeared, and writing remained, abstraction triumphing over object. The Sumerians, perhaps without realizing it, had created not only notation but concept. They had transformed the physical into the idea, the local into the universal. The earliest signs were pictographs, miniatures of what they named, a fish, a jar, a star. Gradually, necessity simplified them. A captured fish became but a few incised lines, a jar turned into an angled wedge. To press stylus into wet clay was faster than carving curves, and soon lines collapsed into stylized strokes shaped like tiny nails. From these nails, or cuneus in Latin, came the word cuneiform. Each sign could now represent not only an object, but a sound, a syllable. The leap was immense, a translation from drawing to language, transforming art into structure, story into data. This visual compression mirrored a deeper cognitive evolution. To see a wedge and hear a word inside it meant the human mind had begun mapping layers of abstraction, connecting symbol to sound, sound to meaning. Communication leapt beyond what voices could carry across a marketplace. Writing stabilized time itself. Words no longer vanished with breath. The Sumerians could revisit decrees, contracts, dreams. Anything recorded became eternal, its truth immune to distance and death. In the archives of Uruk and Lagash, thousands of tablets once lay stacked in precise rows. Here was the first database, an administrative heartbeat of civilization. Clay served as both paper and hard drive, storing counts of crops, lists of workers, hymns, and medical recipes. Scribes were the keepers of this growing web of information. Trained from childhood, they rehearsed signs on thin slices of mud, repeating scripts until memory merged with motion. Their reed stylus became an extension of thought itself. To be a scribe was to touch immortality, for nothing survived a flood or a king's tantrum better than baked clay. Cuneiform spread quickly beyond Sumer, adopted by Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, morphing into new dialects, yet maintaining its core geometry. The script became the passport of authority. To inscribe something in clay was to make it law. Treaties, myths, even personal letters moved through this network of wedges like signals racing along the synapses of the ancient world. Civilization had learned to think externally, projecting memory into a material form. There was poetry in the very act of writing. Each tablet began with damp earth taken from the riverbanks, the same soil that fed crops and birthed their myths of creation. Words, too, were molded from clay and dried in sunlight, mirroring the human body formed from the same dust. When a scribe pressed the stylus, he repeated the gesture of the gods fashioning mankind, leaving fingerprints of intelligence in the skin of the world. To read those tablets today is to hear a long echo of that first awakening. Every letter you trace on a page, every keystroke captured in digital light, carries the breath of those Sumerian signs. Humanity has used countless alphabets since, but each remains an echo of that first moment when civilization looked at mud and saw meaning, when silence acquired form and thought climbed from the tongue into the permanence of clay. The language of clay spread swiftly, but its words were not the only messages carried beyond the horizon. Alongside the flow of stories and symbols came the movement of goods. Jade from the Far East, lapis from Afghan mountains, cedar from distant Lebanon, copper and tin from lands so remote that they blurred into legend. The Sumerians called their merchants tamkaru, wanderers who crossed deserts and ridden seas in pursuit of exchange. To them, trade was a sacred act, an extension of the same balance Utu demanded in justice. To measure fairly was to honor the cosmic equilibrium. To explore was to imitate the gods' own wanderings. Archaeologists have uncovered hints of a network that defies our standard timelines. In tombs at Ur, lapis lazuli gleamed, a mineral that could only have come from the mountains of Badakhshan 1,000 miles to the northeast. Beads carved from carnelian arrived from the Indus Valley, their surfaces polished with techniques unknown in Mesopotamia. In exchange, Sumerian wool, oil, and crafted metalwork journeyed outward along caravan routes that curved through Iran and down toward the Persian Gulf. There, wooden ships waited, sturdy vessels of bitumen-sealed planks that could ride monsoon winds to lands whose languages have long since vanished. How did sailors of that early millennium know the seas so well? They left no maps on parchment, no compasses or sextants. Yet the evidence of their wake lies in scattered cargo, in traces of bitumen found on Indian shores that match the chemical signature of Mesopotamian deposits. Scholars studying wind patterns have realized that the periodic reversal of monsoons provides a window of travel almost to the day each year. The Sumerians must have watched the skies and learned through generations that every season has its rhythm. They read the wind's song as carefully as they once read the movements of planets. The port of Dilmun, long mythologized as a paradise of eternal freshness, served as their gateway. There, merchants traded copper from Oman, pearls from the sea, and grain from the valleys upriver. From Dilmun, they sailed along coasts glowing with unfamiliar constellations, using stars not for worship, but for navigation. Clay fragments from Uruk mention ships bound for Meluha, likely the Indus Valley, carrying silver, barley, and woolens in return for ivory and precious stones. To glimpse that scale of movement 4,500 years ago is to see the embryonic veins of what we now call globalization. Each voyage was perilous. A single misread wind could scatter cargo and crew into oblivion. Yet they undertook the risk, driven not solely by profit, but by a hunger that seems uniquely human, the need to meet the horizon halfway. In marketplaces along their routes, they traded more than goods. Languages mingled, myths migrated. The story of the flood, traces of cuneiform numerology, even musical intervals have cousins in lands that never shared a border. Exchange quietly shaped thought long before any empire united it. Back in the cities, merchants returned with wonders that stretched imagination. Ivory figurines, monkeys alive in woven baskets, spices fragrant enough to perfume an entire courtyard. The scribes recorded receipts with astonishing precision. Quantities of imported metal weighed against barley or textiles. Contracts stamped with seals showing ships under full sail. Each transaction served as both proof and prophecy, suggesting that knowledge itself could travel like cargo and grow richer through distance. When historians today trace genetic or cultural patterns across continents, they find faint fingerprints leading back to these same roots, to people whose calendars were measured by stars and whose ambitions mapped the unseen. Those early traders may not have understood that they were pioneering more than commerce. They were teaching humanity how to think globally, to recognize correspondence between faraway edges of the world. Often we imagine the age of exploration beginning with sails of white canvas in the 15th century. But it started here, in the Bronze Age dawn, when sailors of bitumen-black hulls set out guided only by constellations and courage. They proved that even in an age of clay tablets and reed boats, curiosity could span oceans. Their journey wrote a new kind of story across the face of the earth, a story of connection, of daring, and of the endless conversation between wind, water, and the human will to discover what lies beyond the known shore. Long before the clatter of abacuses or the hum of modern machines, Sumer counted the world through a lattice of numbers that would outlast every city they built. Arithmetic, there was not a classroom discipline, but a sacred craft, as essential as pottery or irrigation. To the Sumerians, numbers were not inventions, but discoveries. Divine patterns already embedded in creation, waiting patiently to be noticed. Among these patterns, one number dominated, a quiet cornerstone of order. 60. It governed their calendars and their stars, their contracts and their concept of perfection. To measure life, they first bent reality into the rhythm of that divine base. It began with the reeds. Farmers needed to divide the floodplain into plots so the taxes of grain could be known, and priests had to track lunar months to decide when festivals would return. Counting on fingers gave 10, but 10 did not harmonize comfortably with the cycles of the moon or the wanderings of planets. 12, however, matched both seasons and constellations. 5 hands could reach that dozen. Multiply here, divide there, and the pliant number 60 appeared, a fertile product of 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s, the most divisible of all integers within their reach. From that fortuitous nexus, the sexagesimal system was born. The convenience of 60 proved transformative. Their scribes sliced the circle of the heavens into 6 parts and then subdivided each segment until the path of stars could be drawn with astonishing accuracy. This division, symbolic of wholeness, survived to become our modern degrees, minutes, and seconds. Tiny echoes of Sumerian mathematics ticked out by every wristwatch. When you glance at a clock, you are quietly reading their philosophy. That time itself bends naturally around 60. But the Sumerians were not content merely to measure. They understood relationships within numbers, producing tables of multiplication, reciprocals, and even quadratic equations neatly inscribed on clay. To handle fractions, they shifted values left or right, anticipating positional notation. In some cases, scribes recorded geometric calculations so precise they prefigured the principles of the Pythagorean theorem by centuries. Archaeologists studying a tablet known as Plimpton 322 still argue whether it represents a list of numerical exercises or the work of astronomers trying to map the sky using ratios of sides and diagonals. Either way, the evidence suggests that Sumerian mathematics reached levels of abstraction far beyond what agriculture alone demanded. Was it ingenuity or inheritance? Some scholars suspect their precision hints at knowledge deepened by older traditions, echoes of counting systems from forgotten cultures along vanished coastlines. Others see pure empirical brilliance, priests of the stars refining technique generation by generation until ritual gave way to reason. The Sumerians themselves resolved the debate differently. They credited wisdom to the gods. Enki or Nabu, deities of intellect, were said to have gifted humanity with calculation so that mortals could mirror cosmic structure. To count correctly was to imitate creation itself. Each equation, a small act of worship, aligning the world to celestial grace. The temples became laboratories where scribes rehearsed arithmetic rituals by lamplight. Clay tablets filled with neat columns of wedges, 72 times 60 multiplied by itself, divided again. Each row an offering to order. Their mathematics was music and spell, humming softly beneath society's surface. The tax collector, the astronomer, and the architect all spoke the same numerical language. Commerce, science, and theology shared a base. And yet behind that perfect symmetry lingered a philosophical undertone. If numbers could capture the shapes of stars, perhaps they could also describe ethics, architecture, or the pulse of life itself. The Sumerians glimpsed something we now call the universality of mathematics, a bridge between human thought and natural law. When they traced orbits across a sexagesimal sky, they were announcing a truth that continues to rule our modern world. Laws of proportion and harmony reach beyond generations, remaining constant even when empires fade. Today our calendars, angles, and seconds still march to their ancient beat. Every time the minute hand completes its circle or an astronomer charts a star's degrees, That silent inheritance lives again. In the simplest arithmetic taught to children or the complex equations guiding satellites, the breath of Sumerian math endures, a whisper from the dawn reminding us that understanding the universe begins, as it always did, with the act of counting what was once considered the mathematics of the gods. Even among scholars who can translate entire epics from shards of clay, a quiet fascination lingers with objects that seem to outpace their age. Scattered among the ruins of Mesopotamia are artifacts so tantalizingly odd that they blur the border between craftsmanship and invention. Stone drills bored through diorite, harder than steel. Delicate copper tubes corroded into spiral lace. Clay jars fitted with iron rods that later generations would nickname the Baghdad Battery. When these relics first emerged into light, archaeologists cataloged them dutifully. But rumor and wonder have a way of escaping even the most disciplined notebooks. Soon the air around them shimmered with speculation. Had the Sumerians touched a technology that history forgot? The so-called battery, discovered near Baghdad in the 1930s, seemed at first glance unremarkable. A small clay jar sealed with bitumen, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. Modern experimenters found that replicas of it can produce a faint current when filled with vinegar or grape juice, enough to tingle a fingertip or plate a coin in thin gold. To some, this was proof that the ancients had dabbled in electricity. To others, it was coincidence, a lucky echo of modern circuitry born from nothing more exotic than storage for sacred scrolls. Without written instructions beside it, the jar remains a riddle that flickers between science and imagination. Then there are the copper tubes of Uruk, slender and unnervingly precise, their joins seamless even under magnification. Did they belong to instruments for measurement, to religious ornament, or something more utilitarian, a plumbing system for the ziggurat's gardens? Each theory generates its counter-theory, and in that tension lies the irresistible thrill of mystery. We peer into their corroded interiors and sense a whisper from artisans who perhaps never intended marvels but achieved them by patience alone. Skeptical minds insist that advanced results do not require advanced machines. The Sumerians already possessed metallurgy subtle enough to create composite alloys, simple acids for etching, and mathematics fine enough to design mirrored cylinders for ceremonial water clocks. Ingenious experiment, combined with thousands of years of practice, can produce wonders that appear impossible. And yet, one cannot entirely suppress the other impulse, the ache of curiosity asking, what if? What if a craft was lost, not because it was too strange, but because it was too ordinary to record, swallowed by the floods of time, like so many of their cities? These puzzles reveal more about us than about Sumer. We long to find echoes of ourselves in the distant dark, to believe that understanding is cyclical, that brilliance rises and falls like the stars. The Baghdad Battery becomes a mirror for our own unease with linear progress. It whispers that history might be less a ladder than a tide, that knowledge could ebb and return disguised. Perhaps that is why such artifacts ignite the imaginations of both scientists and dreamers. They remind us that discovery itself is an emotional state, a balance between doubt and wonder. Whatever their true purpose, those humble cylinders and jars embody the Sumerian spirit that once filled mathematics and mythology alike. The drive to experiment with matter and symbol, to make clay and metals speak. Even the most practical workshop in Uruk would have been half-temple, its laborers aware that every spark of innovation echoed the creativity of their gods. When we study these remnants, we stand not above the ancients, but beside them, hands dusty, leaning over the same questions of function and meaning. In the end, the mystery of these objects may be their greatest gift. They ask us to hold two truths at once, that the past was both ordinary and extraordinary, pragmatic and magical. Each chipped relic bridges those opposites like a wire between ages, conducting the small but potent current of curiosity that still powers every act of discovery. Whether or not those ancient jars ever glowed with electricity, they continue to light up the mind, reminding us that the greatest invention humanity ever achieved wasn't metal or magnetism, but the endless capacity to wonder what else might be hidden in the dark. Long after the first ziggurats had crumbled and the sea winds had buried fields once bright with barley, a single tower rose in story so tall it cast its shadow across every language. The Sumerians had named it Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, a vast stepped monument dedicated to Marduk in later Babylon, but born, in essence, from Sumer's earliest visions of alignment between the mortal and divine. Its base reached deep into the floodplain. Its summit was said to brush the realm of the stars. To climb it was to reenact the ancient dream of bridging earth and sky. In later centuries, that dream became a warning. The remnants of Etemenanki drifted into Hebrew narrative as the Tower of Babel, where humanity's single tongue split into a chorus of confusion. The two stories, one sacred, one tragic, mirror the same anxiety. What happens when human ambition strains the harmony of the world? The Sumerians built upward as devotion. Later generations remembered the gesture as rebellion. Yet, hidden inside both versions lies an uncanny historical clue. For in the centuries after Sumer's fall, the unity of its culture dissolved, not by divine wrath, but by migration, climate change, and the Babel-like divergence of its speech into the many dialects of Mesopotamia. Archaeologists tracing settlement layers find evidence of floods that forced families from one city-state to another, caravans breaking apart as trade routes shifted, herders adapting to new river courses. Each group carried its language like a flame cupped against the wind. Separated by distance, their words drifted apart. The tongue that once counted clay tokens and sang hymns to Inanna became, within a few centuries, the Akkadian of Babylon, the Assyrian of Nineveh. By the time scribes returned to copy old Sumerian hymns, they did so as students of a dead language, translating their own ancestors. The myth of Babel feels less like an invention than an echo of memory. The recollection of a moment when one voice became many, when meaning cracked and scattered like sun-baked clay. Etemenanki itself may have stood for over 1,000 years, rebuilt repeatedly atop its own ruins. Its name alone captures Sumer's yearning for synthesis. Heaven's foundation anchored firmly in mud. Climbing its terraces, one could imagine seeing not only the horizon, but the boundaries between peoples dissolving, a reminder that connection was once possible. Yet that very ideal made the tower vulnerable. When empires rose and fell, each sought to claim or rebuild it, plastering new brick over old faith. The monument became a palimpsest of conquests, every tier another translation, every language layering over the last until none could grasp the original voice that called for its creation. The biblical storytellers turned that confusion into parable. Humanity, once united by a single word, punished for aspiring beyond measure, scattered into nations babbling in incomprehension. But perhaps, beneath the moral, they preserved an older Sumerian insight, that communication itself is sacred architecture. To speak the same language is to build invisible bridges. To lose it is to watch those bridges collapse. The fracture of speech that followed Sumer's decline was not divine judgment, but the birth of diversity. Each new dialect preserved the part of the original, refracted like light through storm clouds into color. Today, linguists can still trace faint seams where those branches split, reconstructing Proto-Sumerian phrases that survived like fossils inside later tongues. House becomes Bitum, becomes Bayit. God becomes Ilu, becomes El. Beneath our modern vocabularies, the murmurs of ancient builders persist. Even the very concept of a foundation echoes their eternal metaphor. Perhaps that is what Itamananki truly meant. Not arrogance, not punishment, but the memory of unity. An attempt to mortar heaven and earth, mind and element, word and meaning. When the tower finally fell, its materials were repurposed into homes, workshops, and temples scattered across Mesopotamia. The story itself became its final form, carried by every language that descended from the plane it once touched. In that sense, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth was never destroyed. It was translated endlessly into the speech of all who still try, through words or faith or science, to understand one another under the same boundless sky. As languages began to drift apart and the stones of the great towers weathered into anonymous hills, another transformation quietly unfolded across the plains. The gods who had once spoken through storms, water, and celestial fire began to fall silent. Or rather, their voices were claimed by men. Time has a way of pulling divinity closer to earth, reshaping awe into authority. In Sumer and the civilizations that followed, the eternal symphony of heaven found new conductors wearing crowns instead of halos. The shift did not happen in a single decree. It was a slow migration of power from temple to throne, from prayer to policy, until the two were indistinguishable. The earliest rulers called themselves shepherds of the people, servants chosen by the gods to maintain order. But gradually, that modest link transformed. Kings began inscribing their names alongside those of deities, claiming ancestry through divine unions or celestial blessings. The walls of Uruk and Lagash filled with hymns that were also royal proclamations, merging worship with propaganda until every tax and conquest could be justified as an act of divine will. The gods had once built humankind to serve them in labor. Now kings invoked the same design, demanding obedience as if their commands carried voices from the sky. Art and architecture reflected the new theology. Where older statues depicted gods towering above mortals, later carvings showed kings standing shoulder to shoulder with them, or even receiving tools of rule directly from their hands. A ruler's scepter became an extension of the god's rod, his throne a continuation of heaven's own seat. The lineage of heaven was rewritten into family trees, cementing sovereignty not as election by fortune, but inheritance by blood. The great temple complexes, once collective centers where priests interpreted signs in shared councils, turned into courtly palaces. The scribes who had recorded rituals began writing laws and decrees. The same stylus that drew star charts now etched edicts of taxation and warfare. Religion provided the grammar. Politics wrote the sentences. The people prayed for rain in the same breath they praised their king's campaigns. This subtle conquering of the sacred by the secular did not destroy faith. It reorganized it. The notion of cosmic hierarchy found its echo in human governance. Just as the heavens were tiered, gods below higher gods, planets circling stars, so too were the classes of earth arranged in nested order. King, priest, soldier, servant. The universe became a mirror of bureaucracy, an empire of meaning structured like the cities along the Euphrates. And in that reflection, humans found reassurance that their society was not arbitrary, but patterned intentionally after creation itself. Still, under the golden rhetoric of divine descent, there pulsed a quiet anxiety. Each new dynasty struggled to prove its sacred legitimacy against the memory of the old gods who had once stood above all mortality. The kings built higher ziggurats, minted seals inscribed with celestial symbols, sacrificed wealth to temples under their control. They hoped that grandeur could replace the ineffable. But every empire's splendor carried seeds of its erosion. As power centralized, belief spread thin. The distance between ruler and ruled widened until faith, which had united cities, began to fracture them. By the time the Babylonian scribes copied the last Sumerian prayers into their catalogues, divine authority had become a script rehearsed by mortal actors. Gods were now figures of ancestry or metaphor, invoked during coronations and battles, but no longer directly feared. Yet behind each proclamation stretched an unbroken shadow, the yearning for legitimacy, for cosmic permission to govern and to be governed. That yearning, once addressed to the heavens, now echoed within palaces and parliaments across every age that followed. The transformation from gods to kings was not a conclusion, but a template, playing endlessly through history. The instinct to wrap human power in the garment of the eternal so that it might endure, if only a little longer, under the indifferent gaze of the stars. The reign of kings gave Sumer a sense of permanence, but beneath the ceremonies of order, the ground itself had begun to betray them. The very rivers that had once been the arteries of the world's first civilization turned restless. Canals clogged with silt, marshes spread where farmland once gleamed with grain. And the winds that swept across the plains grew hotter, drier, cutting through the air like invisible knives. Nature, which had been partner and deity for millennia, began whispering its discontent. At first, the changes were subtle. Fields near the southern Gulf no longer yielded as much barley, forcing farmers to carve deeper channels in search of water. Those channels drew salt up from the soil, and with each harvest the land grew whiter, poisoned by the very irrigation that sustained it. By 2100 BCE, yields had dropped by half. Records on clay tablets became increasingly desperate. Arguments over water rights, decrees shifting populations northward, hymns to the gods pleading not for victory, but for rain. The old balance of flood, sowing, and plenty was unraveling. Yet the Sumerians, always problem solvers, refused to see apocalypse. They built new levees, dug longer canals, and prayed louder. The priests blamed neglect of offerings, the kings blamed neighboring city-states. The scribes dutifully recorded each failure as omen. But the truth was written into the earth itself. A long rhythm of climate shifts had tilted against them. The once predictable Euphrates began wandering eastward while the Tigris carved deeper into its banks, abandoning settlements that had grown entirely dependent on its proximity. Cities found themselves landlocked or stranded in salt flats. Boats rotted on what was now desert floor. As the environment turned hostile, politics followed. Competition for dwindling fields sparked wars between cities that had once shared deities and language. Ur fought Lagash. Lagash turned on Umma. Alliances fractured with every drought. Into this turmoil came pastoral tribes from the western steppes, Akkadians, Amorites, drawn by rumor of ancient wealth, their migrations accelerated by the same desiccation. The meeting of nomad and farmer, of hunger and hierarchy, turned the plain into a battlefield. Archaeologists reading the layers of destruction see it clearly. Towers once luminous, with glaze reduced to ash. Temples split by earthquake and abandonment. In the ruins of Ur, excavators found half-finished tablets lying beside styluses, as though scribes had fled mid-sentence. History itself paused mid-breath. The last inscriptions of Sumer end not with prophecy but with inventory. Lists of grain, taxes, and then nothing at all. the language itself extinguished by silence. For centuries, scholars thought the collapse sudden, the vengeance of gods or invaders, but the evidence tells a slower, sadder story. Sumer died of 1,000 small imbalances, each ignored until they converged. The same precision that built levees and calendars could not conceive that nature might change beyond calculation. The rivers shifted because of tectonic tilt. Rainfall migrated north, and the great plain that had once been cradle became grave. And yet, amid the ruin, a strange continuity endured. The newcomers adopted fragments of Sumerian culture, their gods, their script, their laws, translating them into Akkadian, ensuring that memory survived even as the people who created it vanished. Civilization proved mortal, but its ideas, as always, migrated. Seen from our distance, the fall of Sumer reads like a letter addressed to the future. It warns that the partnership between humanity and environment is not contract, but constant. Dialogue. When that conversation falls silent, collapse follows. Not from divine wrath, but from indifference and exhaustion. The tablets that stop mid-sentence remind us that progress must breathe with the planet that hosts it. Beyond those broken cities, wind still moves through the reeds, the same wind that once filled Sumer's sails and carried its songs. It whispers an enduring truth they learned too late, that no matter how high we build or how artfully we count, civilization stands only as long as the earth is willing to sustain the rhythm of its heart. In the long silence after Sumer's decline, the desert wind carried dust across its abandoned courtyards, smoothing the sharp edges of brick until only gentle mounds remained. But beneath that quiet surface, the currents of its thought still moved unseen. When the Akkadians, and later the Babylonians, claimed the plains, they found not emptiness, but inheritance. The canals may have silted, yet the language of clay persisted, signs pressed and dried that still glinted with the logic and wonder of an earlier age. The newcomers did what all inheritors of empires do. They rewrote history in their own tongue while absorbing its truths in secret. In Babylon, the libraries filled once more. Sumerian tablets, copied and translated into Akkadian, became sacred scripts studied by scribes who no longer fully understood the language, yet revered its cadence. They called the old tongue the speech of scholars, a key to divine insight, much as Latin would become for later monks. They believed that by repeating these signs, they could still access ancient wisdom, as though the act of copying itself was a ritual of communion. And in a way, it was. Knowledge, after all, does not need belief to survive. It simply asks for repetition. The gods evolved too, draped in new names, but recognizable in outline. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki transformed into Ea, Utu into Shamash. The myths traveled like migrating birds, finding new roosts in every dialect. The story of the flood resurfaced in Babylonian epics, its hero now renamed Gilgamesh's confidant, its moral expanded from local warning to cosmic judgment. Even the old Sumerian hymns, once sung to the rhythm of canal water, echoed in more complex Babylonian compositions, full of measured rhyme and grandeur. The heart of Sumer lived on, pulsing inside a new body of empire. Babylon, for all its splendor, was as much archive as city. Each brick bore inscriptions proclaiming the lineage of rulers back to the mythical kings of the first cities. Every palace wall told stories that had already been ancient for 2 millennia. It was as if the Babylonians had built their towers not to dominate the present, but to stabilize the memory of the past. To carve the same symbols into fresh clay was to reassert continuity with the origins of civilization. In this ritual of preservation, they revealed an unspoken fear that forgetting was the real apocalypse. Even as time moved forward, the medium of memory evolved. Clay gave way to parchment, chisels to pens. The script changed, the alphabet softened, yet the underlying hunger remained the same: to record, organize, explain. Each empire added its own commentary, its scribes annotating the margins of previous wisdom. The journey of knowledge began to resemble a single continuous text, written by countless hands across millennia, smudged but ongoing. Eventually, those writings found readers beyond the region's fall. Greek travelers marveled at the astronomical records the Babylonians inherited from their Sumerian ancestors, adapting them into the heliocentric models that would shape modern science. Biblical genealogies absorbed Mesopotamian kings and floods into their lineage of creation. Thousands of years later, archaeologists with dust-coated faces unearthed these same stories and deciphered them once more, restoring the chain of transmission. The message had not been lost, only translated again and again, moving from clay to papyrus, from ink to print, and now into lighted screens where digital code performs the same role as cuneiform strokes. To study that migration is to realize that ideas behave more like rivers than monuments. They do not stay confined to their beds. They overflow, branch, evaporate, and return as rain in distant lands. The flood that erased Sumer also spread its seed. Every modern alphabet, calendar, and calculation carries its residue, subtle as silt. Through Babylon's gates, through the scholars of Nineveh and the libraries of Alexandria, the lineage of Sumer still hums inside the circuitry of our world. What the Sumerians first inscribed in clay became the grammar of civilization itself. Proof that knowledge does not die when empires fall. It changes medium, awaiting rediscovery, whispering through time that memory, when shared, becomes its own form of immortality. When the first spades returned to the plains of Mesopotamia in the 19th century, the archaeologists believed they were exhuming history. They imagined that with enough careful digging, the past would reveal itself tidily, like a library waiting to be dusted off. But the deeper they dug, the more ambiguous the story became. And the archaeologist's role changed from historian to interpreter, from witness to participant. Each discovery carried within it both revelation and doubt, a dialogue between science and imagination that has never truly been resolved. Today, the task of uncovering Sumer's remnants is not confined to the trenches. It stretches across laboratories, diplomatic meetings, and whispered debates between universities guarding their own fragments of truth. The ruins lie beneath modern nations whose shifting borders are layered atop ancient ones, and every artifact unearthed instantly becomes a question of ownership. Whose past is Sumer? Uruk's? Humanity's? Each claim shapes how the story is told. Governments see in archaeology a chance to anchor identity. Scholars see in it a lifetime of data to define careers. Between those aspirations, the ground itself waits, patient but fragile, its baked tablets still murmuring under centuries of dust. The difficulties are not only political. Excavation is destruction by definition, a paradox every archaeologist lives with. To extract the evidence that explains the past, one must disturb it forever. Every trench cut into a site eliminates context, even as it reveals it. The excitement of discovery collides with the quiet mourning of what is lost. The best scientists proceed as if performing surgery on a dying patient, knowing they save some knowledge by sacrificing another. Layers of once unbroken silence are peeled away to reveal walls and bones, each telling incomplete truths. Anomalies complicate the picture further. Occasionally, a site yields artifacts that do not belong to their strata, metals advanced beyond their expected date, architectural alignments more precise than instruments thought available. One shard of polished glass suggests impossible craftsmanship. A carved seal shows creatures unknown to biology. The anomalies invite speculation, and speculation breeds myth. Some researchers hold fast to skepticism, others to curiosity, and between them hangs the restless spirit of inquiry that is neither fact nor faith. The archaeological record becomes not merely physical evidence, but a mirror reflecting the limits of our own understanding. In this way, science itself begins to resemble the myths it seeks to decipher. The archaeologist chasing origins becomes a hero in an epic of endurance, wrestling with bureaucracy and envy rather than demons and floods. Grants take the place of divine favor. Rival academics become pantheon adversaries. The laboratories where artifacts are tested hum with the same ritualistic precision as temples once did. Even the language of reports, discovery, revelation, truth, rings with the vocabulary of sacred encounters. We demand from the earth not just information, but meaning, and the impossibility of final certainty keeps the narrative alive, forever unfinished. Meanwhile, the desert resumes its steady reclamation. Wind fills trenches between seasons of work, covering exposed bricks as if to remind humanity that knowledge is borrowed, not owned. Every monument uncovered begins, instantly, its journey back into ruin. Preservation teams fight humidity and war, while elsewhere illicit trade disperses relics into private hands, scattering the very context that gives them voice. The paradox tightens. To preserve history, we must disturb it. To protect the past, we must keep it hidden. Perhaps the deeper dilemma is emotional rather than technical. Archaeologists are human, drawn by wonder, yet bound by caution. They stand at the edge between what can be proven and what can only be imagined, aware that even their most rigorous conclusions will one day be revised. After decades of excavation, they begin to sound like poets, describing the earth itself as storyteller and trickster. In the end, every artifact is both evidence and myth, a fact shaped by the hearts of those who uncover it. And so, the quest for Sumer continues, not to conquer its secrets, but to remain astonished by them, digging carefully, reverently, knowing that within each handful of soil lies a fragment of our own reflection. Every civilization leaves behind not only ruins, but riddles. And the further we move from Sumer's sun-baked horizons, the more the line between evidence and imagination begins to shimmer. While archaeologists sift patiently through tablets and carbon dates, another human impulse rises beside them, the need for wonder, for stories that leap where data hesitates. It is a tension as old as curiosity itself, the quiet duel between science and legend. One speaks in measurements, the other in awe. Both seek the same prize, meaning amid fragments of clay. Modern interpreters have often armed their imaginations with extraordinary theories. Some claim that the gods of Sumer were visitors from the stars, engineers from another world who taught humankind agriculture, astronomy, and writing before vanishing into the void. Others insist that a lost civilization predating Sumer transmitted advanced knowledge of geometry and power, its memory surviving as myth. These tales are dismissed by scholars as fantasy, yet they persist because they fill an absence the strict record cannot. An emotional gap between knowing how something happened and understanding why it began at all. Rational investigation marches under the banner of method, stratigraphy, radiocarbon, linguistic lineage. It is slow, meticulous, sometimes painfully humble, A single artifact misread can rewrite centuries, and so caution becomes reverence. But legend has its own momentum. It thrives on coincidence and pattern, on shapes glimpsed in the fog of possibility. When the data ends, the imagination begins its pilgrimage, connecting points too distant for proof, but too seductive to ignore. The idea that knowledge might have descended fully formed from the heavens appeals to the part of us that still longs for contact with origins greater than ourselves. Yet, in a sense, the ancient astronaut narrative is only another version of older myths. The Sumerians themselves spoke of the Anunnaki bearing gifts from the skies, just as their descendants told of messengers and angels. The difference is vocabulary, not desire. Each age translates wonder into the language it trusts. Where the priests saw gods, some moderns see extraterrestrials. Where scholars see toil and evolution, dreamers see inheritance. Both reveal the same unwillingness to accept that greatness could arise solely from trial and error. From ordinary hands shaping extraordinary vision through patience rather than miracle. Scientists, for their part, sometimes underestimate how mystery nourishes belief. The more data strips myths of its shine, the more fiercely imagination adapts, like a vine clinging to whatever structure remains. The myths we reject for lack of proof often resurface in new forms. Films, conspiracies, online forums. Because the human mind abhors a vacuum, uncertainty feels intolerable, yet simultaneously irresistible. It is easier to believe in lost wisdom than to accept that knowledge can vanish forever into dust. And perhaps, behind the polarization of scholar and fantasist, lies a shared craving: continuity. The thought that the Sumerians were visited by beings of unimaginable skill, or that they inherited knowledge from a forgotten age, is an antidote to fragility. It promises that progress will never fully disappear, that once attained, enlightenment survives somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered. The data-driven archaeologist, too, seeks that endurance. Each new translation, another attempt to rescue meaning from extinction. In truth, both sides serve the same muse: wonder itself. The scientist channels it into hypothesis, the storyteller into revelation. The difference is not moral, but musical. One plays in measured tempo, the other improvises. Between them lies the harmony that keeps civilization questioning. For without skepticism, knowledge stagnates, and without wonder, discovery loses its fire. As the desert resumes its dominating quiet, a breeze crosses the eroded ziggurats, carrying two whispers, one of measurement, the other of myth. Somewhere between them stands humanity. Notebook in one hand, dream in the other, unwilling to silence either voice. The attraction of mystery may never yield to proof entirely, for mystery is the shadow by which truth reveals its shape. When the first fragments of cuneiform arrived in the hands of European scholars, they were little more than bruised shards of colorless clay. Yet across their surfaces danced strange wedges, rows of tiny marks that seemed as indecipherable as the murmurs of stone. The men and women who devoted their lives to unlocking them became the next generation of storytellers, inheritors of Sumer's own scribal tradition. But translation is never neutral. It is an act of decision, and every decision tilts the scale of meaning. What we believe about Sumer today rests on the interpretive fingerprints of those who first gave its silence a voice. The earliest translators were more adventurers than linguists. In the mid-19th century, Henry Rawlinson dangled from a rope along a Persian cliff face to copy inscriptions, convinced they held the key to understanding the ancient Near East. His meticulous transcriptions birthed the first bilingual dictionary of cuneiform, allowing later scholars to read commercial invoices, hymns, and royal decrees untouched for 4,000 years. Yet Rawlinson, steeped in Victorian rationalism, saw the tablets chiefly as historical record. To him, they marked humanity's first bureaucrats, not its first philosophers. His subtle bias toward the practical over the poetic, codified a generation's perception of Sumer as pragmatic, functional, almost modern. Others leaned the opposite way. A few decades later, scholars like George Smith were driven by religious curiosity. When Smith uncovered the Flood tablet, he ran around the British Museum breathless with awe, certain he had found Noah written in cuneiform. His translation favored theological resonance, emphasizing parallels between Sumerian myth and biblical narrative. In his hands, Mesopotamia became not merely the cradle of civilization, but the echo chamber of Scripture. That choice, deliberate or not, steered Western imagination for the next century. Textbooks began describing the Sumerians as half-biblical patriarchs, their gods proto-versions of later faiths. Each translator inherits not only a language, but the spirit of their times. In the Cold War years, when human progress was measured by scientific advance, Sumerian writing was celebrated as the dawn of rationality. Words describing divine breath or mystical illumination were softened into inspiration, while references to celestial visitors were flattened into astronomers or priests. The same sentences, rendered by a mystic, a linguist, or a skeptic, generate entirely different civilizations. A single glyph meaning sky people could become meteor, angel, or astronomer, depending on the worldview of the person holding the dictionary. In every case, the translator builds a bridge from past to present. But their material, faith, curiosity, or empiricism, determines the bridge's shape. Modern Sumerology tries to stand above those debates, armed with peer review and technology, yet bias remains as persistent as sand. Digital decipherment allows comparison of thousands of tablets, revealing that many earlier translations quietly omitted or adjusted inconvenient phrases. Where one scholar read, "The gods descended," another now reads, "Kings arrived." What was once a miracle might now be a calculation. Data neutralizes emotion, but it also risks erasing the vitality that once made those stories sing. The choice between poetic metaphor and literal explanation is not easily balanced, and in swinging between extremes, we sometimes lose the ambivalent space the Sumerians themselves seem to occupy, a world both mystical and sensible. In the end, translation is less about retrieving words than about recovering perspective. Every interpreter reshapes history to resemble the questions of their own century. Perhaps the Sumerians, masters of dual meanings and layered symbols, understood this inevitability better than we do. They hid multiplicity inside their script on purpose, knowing that truth shifts as the reader does. The lines pressed into clay were never meant to be final. They were invitations across time, asking each generation to listen and respond in its own accent. Our modern readings are simply the latest reply. The translators grant the ancients new voices, but those voices, in turn, remake the translators, reminding them, and us, that meaning is alive only while it searches for understanding. In the quiet halls where the clay tablets now rest, time seems to fold inward. Fluorescent lights hum above glass cases like tame versions of the Sumerian sun, illuminating rows of brown rectangles etched with fingernail-sized wedges. Visitors shuffle, whisper, lean close, and realize that these are not merely artifacts. They are voices. Each tablet carries the texture of a hand that once dipped a reed into wet clay, pressing thoughts into permanence. The air feels charged with an old intimacy. Humans, still trying to speak across the gulf of centuries, still hoping that someone will read and understand. To stand before one of these tablets is to meet civilization in its rawest form. The words do not sing with the elegance of later scrolls or crumbling vellum. They are blunt, sturdy, practical. And yet beneath lists of taxes or shipments runs a pulse of yearning. Here is a man recording the weight of barley. There a priestess noting the timing of a lunar eclipse. Another scribe sketching a recipe for ink, a mosaic of small purposes that combined reveal humanity's grandest wish: continuity. The oldest written record is not a poem, not a prophecy, but an account. Survival demanded memory, and memory demanded form. When those forms harden into clay, they endure far longer than any paper could. Fire, the same force that destroys, often saved them, baking them accidentally during the burning of cities. Now, thousands of years later, they line museum walls in rows of whispering testimony. Together, they remind us that knowledge is stubborn, that even catastrophe can act as kiln rather than erasure. Each tablet outlasted dynasties, dust storms, conquest, and the human tendency to forget. But preservation is not the same as understanding. Walking through these displays, one notices how many labels read undeciphered, fragmentary, context unknown. The past survives in body, but not in soul. We can see the lines, but only guess their tone. It is the fragility of memory rendered physical, proof that even the best intentions crumble without context. And yet the awareness of that fragility fuels the very engine of discovery. We study because the past is slipping away, and in saving it, we remember ourselves. The lessons the tablets teach are not technical alone. They speak of patience, of humility in the face of what will always elude us. Every wedge mark shows the collaboration of mind and material, an understanding that thought becomes real only when it leaves a mark somewhere. The Sumerians must have known, even as they labored over their script, that they were participating in something both mundane and cosmic. The act of inscribing one's place in the universe, however briefly. We inherit that impulse each time we write, record, or simply try to capture a fleeting idea before it vanishes. Museums attempt a kind of modern ritual around these artifacts. The glass cases are our new temples, the placards our hymns. Scholars translate and digitize, feeding ancient syllables into databases that recreate lost syntax in electric light. Knowledge migrates again, from clay to code, still breathing, still adaptable. The continuity is hauntingly familiar. When a student taps on a computational tablet, scrolling through digital archives of the original clay, the circle quietly closes, out of earth to circuit, and back again into thought. And so, these humble blocks of baked mud become mirrors more than relics. They remind us that curiosity is the one element time cannot destroy. Empires grow and fade, wars erase monuments, but the desire to know lingers like a spark under ash. The tablets are not just evidence of what humanity discovered, but of why we've always searched at all. Their survival is not coincidence. It is a continuation, a heartbeat still audible beneath the glass. They stand as tests of our patience and proof of our endurance, whispering the simplest, hardest message of all. That understanding, though delayed by millennia, remains possible if we keep listening through the dust. In laboratories scattered across the modern world, the strands of ancient life are being unwound like lost scrolls. Where archaeologists dig through soil, geneticists dig through cells. And what they find mirrors the migrations of language and culture inked long ago on clay. Within the spiraling code of our DNA lie the same roots traced by merchant caravans and rivers. the record of thousands of journeys folded into the nuclei of living things. When scientists map the genetic signatures of populations from the Fertile Crescent outward, a quiet pattern appears, the pulse of Mesopotamia glowing faintly within us all. From the reed-lined marshes of southern Iraq to the distant plains of Central Asia, the genetic echoes of Sumer's descendants ripple outward like waves spreading from a stone dropped into water. The people of those early cities carried not only their grain and craft, but also their genes, mixing with tribes beyond the horizon. Trade that carried copper and lapis also carried bloodlines. Each embrace between travelers, each family founded in a new valley, wrote another invisible tablet inside the body. The same chromosomes that help us inherit our parents' eyes also inherit their pathways. Modern analysis of ancient remains, teeth, bones, even dust speck fragments from long-forgotten graves, reveals these threads connecting us to the early inventors of writing and irrigation. Through the sequencing of genomes, researchers can trace the slow, steady flow of people from Mesopotamia into Anatolia, the Levant, Iran, and eventually the Mediterranean. It was not conquest alone, but quiet diffusion. Farmers following seasons, traders chasing horizon lines, wanderers carrying legends and lullabies that would morph into new tongues. In those strands of DNA, we can almost hear languages changing their accents, myths adjusting their constellations, while the human heart remains the same. What is striking is how cultural and genetic maps overlap. The spread of agriculture mirrors the spread of stories. The movement of words about Inanna or Utu travels along the same corridors as the hereditary markers that identify distant cousins. Memory and molecule journey together, entangled. Even as empires collapsed, life itself continued the work of translation. Genetic recombination and storytelling follow parallel laws. Conserve what works, adapt what must, discard what fails, and always, quietly, begin again. The implications reach beyond science into philosophy. We are accustomed to thinking of heritage as belonging to nations or religions, but in truth, it is older and deeper than any border. Within the helix of modern humanity flows a dilute remnant of those who once built ziggurats, measured time, and pressed styluses into clay. We share with them not only fragments of blood, but the same impulse to preserve, to name, to connect. Our knowledge of that inheritance makes each of us a living archive, a self-contained museum of ancient experiments in survival. Sometimes genetic findings unsettle established myths. They show, for example, how the Indo-European languages may have carried traces of Sumerian syntax through generations of contact, or how populations once thought isolated were, in fact, cousins reunited after thousands of years. Yet rather than diminishing wonder, this revelation expands it. It reminds us that civilization was never a tree with single roots, but a braided river. Genes and ideas mingled freely, shaping humanity into a continuum rather than a lineage. The Sumerians are not a vanished people. They are chapters within our cells, their stories still whispered by mitochondria that have never stopped traveling. If we could listen deeply enough, perhaps the rhythms of our heartbeat echo the drum patterns that once sounded across Uruk's walls. Perhaps faint, molecular memories still vibrate in response to those ancient songs of creation. The science of genetics says no. Our cells remember only chemistry. But poetry suspects otherwise. Between proof and intuition, we find what the Sumerians already knew. Identity is not fixed, but transmitted, reshaped each time it crosses from one generation or one culture to another. The clay of bodies, like the clay of tablets, carries both biology and myth, both data and dream. And when we hold this realization in mind, the story of humanity expands beyond history. revealing itself as one unbroken chain of becoming, stretching from the first cradle of civilization to every living being standing now beneath the same enduring stars. Night over the desert has changed little since the first cities turned to dust. The same constellations drift across the same immensity, patient witnesses to civilizations rising, burning, and beginning again. When the Sumerians looked up from the roofs of their temples, they were asking questions we still shape with different instruments. They traced paths of planets with naked eyes, recording their observations in clay. We launch probes and telescopes instead, our data stored in light rather than mud. Yet the impulse remains identical, to look outward and see ourselves reflected in the dark. For them, the stars were the calm administrators of fate, the celestial scribes writing destinies upon an invisible sky. They believed the heavens watched their rituals, measured their promises, judged their kings. Each god occupied a star or cluster, each movement a commentary. To read the night was to read the thoughts of creation itself. And though our modern cosmos no longer speaks in divine pronouncements, we have not quieted the sense that someone, or something, might be listening. Astronomers wait for signals from distant systems, scanning with antennas as priests once scanned the horizon, both actions expressions of the same ancient longing. To know we are not alone. The machines we build carry that wish outward. Space probes drift beyond the planets, our new messengers of dust and faith. On their sides are plaques etched with diagrams of our bodies, our home star, the pattern of hydrogen. Attempts to translate humanity into the language of the universe. These inscriptions echo the stylus marks pressed into Sumerian tablets. Precise, hopeful, vulnerable. Clay or titanium, both serve one purpose, to speak into the silence and declare existence. Each Voyager probe, still traveling through the deep gulf of interstellar night, is a continuation of that first record keeper inscribing, "1 jar of barley received." Both acts whisper the same phrase. We remember, and we wish to be remembered. Perhaps the Sumerians, watching Venus burn along the dawn line, felt a similar distance between themselves and the divine. Their myths of watchers in the sky may well have been expressions of that yearning, a projection of human attention outward. They could not travel to the heavens, so they populated them with familiar forms, wise observers, guardians of balance. Centuries later, we send watchers of our own into the abyss, crafted from alloy and solar panels. Their eyes are lenses, their prayers telemetry. We wait for their messages like oracles reading star data instead of dreams. The medium has changed, not the desire. There is a tenderness in realizing that every satellite's orbit is a modern ziggurat, a stairway of light circling the planet. Where ancient priests climbed stone terraces to reach sky level, our technology ascends invisibly, carrying our sensors higher with each generation. Each ascent marks faith in knowledge, in our ability to continue the conversation the Sumerians began. When we decode cosmic radiation or photograph a distant galaxy, we fulfill their early conviction that heaven and earth are not separate realms, but parts of one continuum waiting to be understood. Standing beneath these same constellations now, we are their descendants in every sense. Biological, cultural, and imaginative. The stars no longer command our harvests, but they still dictate our sense of wonder. In their cold glow, we measure both our smallness and our persistence. The Sumerians once pointed upward and invented time to track those motions. We point upward and measure deep space to trace our own beginnings. Between those two gestures stretches the entire human story. Civilization as a long act of noticing. So the night closes again over Mesopotamia. But within that darkness, A glimmer endures, an endless exchange of questions between dust and light. The watchers they imagined have become us, and we, watching from a fragile world, imagine again. Our instruments hum, our data streams homeward, our hearts tilt upward, repeating the instinct etched into clay 5,000 years ago. To seek patterns in the heavens, and by seeking, to remember that we too are part of the sky.